There is something quietly remarkable about a world that ended and still kept records of itself, still left behind maps and borders, and the ghost shapes of a nation that once stretched from one ocean to another. And tonight, we are going to walk through all of it together, state by state, through the long and softly lit corridors of Fallout's America, where every region carries its own weight of history. Before we drift any further, maybe tap subscribe for more calming videos, and tell me where you're joining from tonight as we begin moving slowly westward and northward through the ruins of a country that, even in silence, still remembers what it was. Wyoming is as good a place as any to begin, because Wyoming is a state that almost no one in the wasteland ever talks about. And yet the stories that do reach us from that quiet northern territory carry a particular kind of sadness, the sadness of things that fled toward open ground and found only cold waiting for them there. The Great Khans, one of the most enduring raider groups in all of recorded post-war history, are known to have considered Wyoming a possible destination in the event that things went badly for them near the Mojave. Their contingency plans, spoken of in careful terms by those who knew the Khan leadership, pointed northward toward that wide and silent land where the NCR had not yet extended its reach. Wyoming, in the imagination of the Khans, was a place of freedom, a place where a faction beaten and scattered could perhaps reconstitute itself, find room to breathe in the open plateaus, and draw strength from a landscape that asked nothing of politics or allegiance. Whether the Khans ever truly reached those northern ranges depends entirely on how the Second Battle of Hoover Dam resolved itself. And that, of course, is a story with many endings. But the fact that Wyoming existed in their minds as a sanctuary says something meaningful about how the wasteland survivors conceptualized geography, not as lines on a map, but as emotional possibility, as the idea that somewhere far enough away, things might be different. The Whitelegs, that fierce and desperate tribe from the canyon lands of Honest Hearts, also turned their eyes toward Wyoming when their fortunes collapsed. After the battles in Zion ended and the odds turned sharply against them, the surviving members of the Whitelegs moved northward in scattered groups, carrying with them the memory of defeat and the instinct to find somewhere that would not remember their name. Wyoming received them the way it receives most things, with silence and weather. The first winter was the cruelest teacher. Records pieced together from the accounts of survivors suggest that more than half of those who fled into Wyoming's wilderness did not survive the cold. The land that had seemed like open possibility turned out to be indifferent to the needs of people who had never learned to live in it. By the time spring arrived, the Whitelegs as a unified tribe had effectively ceased to exist, their numbers broken into small wandering bands that faded gradually from any record anyone thought to keep. There is something in that story that lingers, the image of a people moving northward through a nuclear winter, carrying nothing but their determination, and finding that determination alone was not enough to answer the cold. Wyoming in the Fallout universe is defined not by what happened there, but by what happened to the people who tried to make it theirs and failed. And that is a kind of history that the Wasteland understands very well. West Virginia, which the game Fallout 76 brought to life with extraordinary care, is a region defined more than most by the layering of beauty over ruin. The land itself, which the game calls Appalachia, is divided into 6 distinct regions, each carrying its own ecological character and its own particular texture of devastation. The forest region in the south holds the gentlest memories of the old world, rolling green hills and small settlements where the signs of human habitation still feel almost recognizable. Moving northward through Toxic Valley, where chemical residue from pre-war industry coats the land in a slow and patient destruction, the landscape begins to make its transformation more legible, more honest about what was lost. The ash heap is perhaps the most direct expression of industrial consequence in all of Fallout's geography. The coal mines of that region have never stopped burning, decades after the bombs fell, and the sky above them holds a permanent quality of gray that makes even midday feel like early evening. The people who worked those mines before the war understood something about slow burning fires, about industries that extracted everything and left behind only the evidence of extraction. And the ash heap, in its post war state, is simply that understanding made visible, written in permanent smoke across the Appalachian sky. The Savage Divide cuts through the center of Appalachia like a spine, a mountain range where pre war wealth built its retreats and observation posts and fortified vacation homes for the people who had enough status to be paranoid about the future. The divide hides its secrets well, and many of the facilities buried in its peaks and valleys carried classified designations that meant most West Virginians never knew they existed. It was a landscape of visible grandeur and invisible purpose, beautiful enough to reassure anyone who looked at it that the world was in reasonable hands. The mire is something different entirely, a dense, fog covered region where the vegetation has grown to claim everything that was once open ground. Vines and roots working their way through concrete and steel with the patient certainty of things that have outlasted whatever built those walls. Creatures adapted to the mist and the close air move through the mire in ways that suggest the landscape itself has developed preferences, that it has decided what belongs and what does not. Cranberry Bog is beautiful in the particular way that dangerous things often are. Its red and violet plant life spread across terrain that hides its hazards beneath a surface of almost abstract color. The Enclave made use of the bog for its remote installations, and the scorch beasts that dominate its skies are among the most significant aerial threats anywhere in Fallout's documented regions. The bog watches everything and gives nothing away easily. The people who emerged from Vault 76 to begin the work of rebuilding Appalachia found a region already dense with the history of those who had tried before them. The responders, that loose alliance of emergency workers and volunteers who had organized themselves around the principle of helping survivors, had already built and lost a great deal by the time the vault opened. Their camps and training centers and supply routes remained scattered through Appalachia, monuments to a kind of civic instinct that survived the bombs even when the institutions those instincts served did not. The Free States movement occupies a particular position in Appalachian history, a group of survivalists who had predicted government overreach long before the bombs fell and had spent years digging their own bunkers beneath the mire, certain that official shelters would either fail or betray the people inside them. When the world ended, they retreated into those hand-built sanctuaries with a sense of having been proven correct that must have been cold comfort given everything else they were losing. Their eventual fate at the hands of the scorched plague was one of the quiet tragedies of Appalachian history. People who had prepared correctly for one kind of disaster and been destroyed by another that none of their preparations had anticipated. The White Spring Bunker beneath the Greenbrier served as a shadow government facility, its existence known to very few of the people who lived above it. The bunker was automated to a degree that allowed it to continue functioning long after the people who had built it were gone. Its systems maintaining routines and protocols in the absence of anyone to give them meaning. This quality of purposeful continuation without purpose is one of the recurring textures of post-war West Virginia, machines keeping faith with instructions they were never told to question. The cryptids of Appalachian folklore add a different layer to the region's identity, one that connects it to a long tradition of storytelling about the mountains and their inhabitants. The Mothman appears in Fallout 76 as something genuinely ambiguous, sometimes passive and observational, sometimes hostile, always suggesting awareness, the sense of being seen by something that has been watching longer than anyone can account for. Its glowing eyes and wide wings have made it the most iconic symbol of Appalachian strangeness, a creature that belongs simultaneously to pre-war legend and post-war reality, bridging those two worlds in a way that few elements of the game quite manage. The Flatwoods Monster, drawn from actual regional UFO encounter reports from the mid-20th century, drifts through Appalachia with a floating quality that makes it seem only loosely committed to the ground beneath it. The Grafton Monster, headless and massive, and apparently motivated by nothing more explicable than presence, haunts the banks of the Tigert River and the ruined town of Grafton with the patience of something that has nowhere else to be and no particular schedule to maintain. Washington State is one of the most underrepresented places in Fallout's geographic record, a fact that feels strange given the state's size and its significant pre-war population and industry. The only confirmed reference to Washington in the game canon comes from a piece of junk mail discovered in Charleston, West Virginia during the events of Fallout 76. The letter originated in Walla Walla, Washington, sent by something called the Rockwell Clearinghouse, which appears to have been a marketing organization attempting the kind of envelope manipulation designed to make recipients open correspondence they would otherwise discard. That a single piece of junk mail constitutes the entirety of Washington's documented presence in Fallout lore is the kind of detail that the games do occasionally, acknowledging a whole state or region through the most mundane possible artifact, through the remnant of commercial communication that survived only because paper is surprisingly durable. Washington's absence from the main narrative of Fallout is itself a kind of statement about the selective nature of any record that survives catastrophe, which is to say that most things are not recorded, and most records are lost, and what remains is almost always insufficient and accidental. Virginia carries a more substantial presence in the Fallout canon, which makes sense given the Commonwealth of Virginia's historical and political significance and its proximity to Washington, which became the capital wasteland of Fallout 3. The suggestion in Fallout 3 that Virginia as a formal entity had been gone for over 200 years gestures toward a wider dissolution of state structures that the games have always treated as essentially complete, yet remnants of Virginian identity persist in curious places. Ondale, a small and deeply unsettling settlement in the capital wasteland, is said to maintain the spirit of the old Commonwealth, its residents carrying on traditions that they believe connect them to something that preceded the war. The nature of what Andale actually preserves is considerably darker than the word tradition usually implies, and the settlement stands as one of Fallout 3's more quietly disturbing environmental stories, a place where continuity has become a kind of madness. The Robco Research Center in Cranberry Bog, confirmed by in-game documents to be located within Virginia's geographical boundaries, represents the kind of industrial and technological presence that the state was known for even before the war. Its administrators' messages reveal a facility that was operational until very late in the pre-war period, continuing its research programs with a kind of institutional momentum that the approaching end of the world had not yet interrupted. Camp Venture in Fallout 76 began as a military training installation connected to the Virginians program, a survivalist and resilience initiative that predated the war and tried to prepare a civilian population for extreme conditions. The fact that such a program existed and operated out of Virginia speaks to an awareness within the pre-war government that preparation for catastrophe was both necessary and politically complicated, something to be embedded in military infrastructure rather than announced as policy. Vermont sits in the quiet periphery of Fallout's documented world, its presence largely implied rather than directly addressed. The Commonwealth of New England, which provides the formal governmental context for Fallout 4's Massachusetts setting, would have incorporated Vermont into its regional structure, and the general sense of New England's post-war fragmentation applies there as much as anywhere. Vermont's landscape, its mountains and forests and small towns and farm communities, would carry the same qualities of natural resilience and human vulnerability that characterize the broader New England wasteland. Texas is a presence in Fallout lore that becomes most significant when considered in the context of what surrounds it. The southwestern regions documented in Fallout, New Vegas and Fallout 1 and 2 all exist in conversation with the vast territory to their east, and Texas, with its oil infrastructure and military installations, an enormous land area, would have been a significant site of both resource extraction and post-war competition. The Texas Commonwealth was one of the 13 administrative regions into which the pre-war United States government divided the country for purposes of emergency management and civil governance. The idea of the Texas Commonwealth as an administrative unit is one of those details that the games plant quietly in terminal entries and loading screen text. The suggestion of a governmental architecture that was superimposed over the familiar shape of American states in the years before the bombs fell. These commonwealths were designed to facilitate coordination in times of crisis, which means that the crisis they were eventually called upon to manage was larger than anything their designers had anticipated. Tennessee carries references in the broader Fallout record that connect it primarily to the pre-war industrial complex and military infrastructure that characterized much of the American South. The region's history of manufacturing and military bases and TVA-style infrastructure projects made it a significant node in the network of facilities that the pre-war government was maintaining and expanding in the final years before the war. South Dakota is notable in the Fallout universe primarily for a reference to its geological character, the Badlands and the Black Hills representing a kind of terrain that would translate in interesting ways to a post-war setting. The Dakota Commonwealth would have administered both North and South Dakota as a single regional unit under the pre-war emergency management structure, and the sparse population and open terrain of both states would have made them simultaneously less immediately valuable and more survivable as targets in a nuclear exchange. Pennsylvania sits at an interesting intersection of Fallout geography, its eastern regions bordering the capital wasteland of Washington, and its western regions sharing territory with the Ohio Commonwealth. Pittsburgh, documented in the Fallout 3 expansion known as the Pit, represents one of the most fully realized industrial post-war settings in the franchise, a city where steel production has continued under conditions of genuine horror, where the value of metal outweighs the value of human life in calculations that the city's rulers make without apparent difficulty. The Pit story is one of the franchise's more morally complicated narratives, presenting a place where productivity and oppression are so thoroughly intertwined that any solution to one problem creates new versions of the other. The steel mills, still operating along the Monongahela River, represent a kind of grim continuity, pre-war industrial capacity, persisting into the post-war world, not because anyone designed it to survive, but because some machinery is simply too large and too embedded to stop entirely. Ohio's presence in the Fallout universe is suggested primarily through the Ohio Commonwealth administrative designation and through scattered references in game texts to communities and facilities in the region. The Ohio River Valley, which plays a significant role in Fallout 76's eastern geography, connects Appalachia to a broader network of pre-war infrastructure that extended throughout the Ohio River watershed. North Carolina is referenced in connection with its pre-war research facilities and military installations, which were part of the broader southeastern military infrastructure that the war both relied upon and destroyed. The Research Triangle area of pre-war North Carolina was home to significant scientific and technological development that would have made it both strategically important and particularly targeted. New York is one of those states that Fallout handles with a kind of tantalizing indirectness, acknowledging its enormous pre-war significance through references and implications while never yet fully depicting it. New York City in the Fallout universe would have been a target of enormous strategic importance, and its post-war state would presumably combine the qualities of massive structural devastation with the sheer density of pre-existing human infrastructure that makes even bombed-out urban environments function as resource-rich territories. New Mexico appears in the Fallout record primarily through Caesar's legions' documented expansion into the territory and through the general context of the Mojave region's eastern connections. The Legion's presence in New Mexico represents the far eastern edge of its documented territorial claims, a region absorbed into the Legion's organizational structure during its period of rapid expansion under Caesar himself. New Jersey edges into Fallout's documented world through references to pre-war corporate activity in manufacturing in the Northeastern Corridor, and its position between New York and Pennsylvania would make it part of a dense network of urban ruin that the games have gestured toward without yet fully exploring. Nevada is perhaps the most extensively documented state in all of Fallout lore, given that the Mojave Desert and its centerpiece city of New Vegas sit at the heart of one of the franchise's most beloved entries. The Nevada Commonwealth's post-war condition is defined by the miracle of New Vegas itself, a city that survived the nuclear exchange largely intact because Robert House had the resources, the intelligence, and the particular kind of obsessive foresight to arrange its protection. The story of New Vegas is fundamentally the story of one man's refusal to accept the terms of the apocalypse. His decision to solve the survival problem through sheer technological and economic power, rather than through any of the more communal strategies that other post-war societies tried. House's Vegas sits at the center of a web of influence and obligation and controlled access that gives it a quality found nowhere else in Fallout's documented geography. The quality of a city that knows exactly what it is worth and has structured every relationship around that knowledge. Hoover Dam represents the physical anchor of Nevada's post-war political significance, a pre-war infrastructure achievement so enormous that it generates the electricity and the water rights that make any serious claim to regional power possible. The NCR's control of Hoover Dam and Caesar's Legion's drive to take it define the central conflict of Fallout New Vegas, and the dam itself functions almost as a character in the narrative, a structure so significant that everyone in the region orients themselves in relation to it. The Brotherhood of Steel Bunker at Hidden Valley, the various raider groups occupying the Mojave's wastes, the followers of the apocalypse with their medical camps and their commitment to knowledge, the Boomers with their Air Force base and their relationship to explosives that borders on the devotional. All of these factions give Nevada a richness of documented political life that few other states can match. Nebraska appears in the broader context of the Midwest, connected to the network of pre-war military and agricultural infrastructure that makes the Great Plains a significant but underdocumented region of Fallout's America. The relative sparseness of the Plains population before the war would have meant that nuclear targeting in the region was focused on specific installations rather than population centers, potentially leaving vast stretches of Nebraska in conditions somewhat more survivable than the dense urban corridors of the coasts. Montana is one of the states that exists in Fallout's imagination primarily as a quality of remoteness, a region defined by its distance from the centers of pre-war power and its corresponding distance from any faction capable of projecting influence that far. The Northern Rockies and the High Plains of Montana would present post-war survivors with a landscape of extraordinary natural resource wealth and extraordinary difficulty of access, a combination that tends to produce either fierce independence or slow isolation. Missouri carries in the Fallout record the weight of its pre-war industrial and military significance, its position at the center of the country's river network, making it a historical hub for both commerce and military logistics. The Missouri River and the Mississippi River together form a geographic backbone for the American interior that post-war survivors would navigate with the same mix of opportunity and danger that pre-war traders had. Always found in river travel, Mississippi connects to the broader narrative of the American South's post-war condition, a region whose pre-war economy and infrastructure were organized around specific kinds of agricultural and industrial production that the war interrupted in specific ways. The Mississippi River Corridor would represent one of the great navigational resources of the post-war interior, a waterway that connects northern states to the Gulf region and that any post-war faction with territorial ambitions would recognize as strategically significant. Minnesota's position in the upper Midwest gives it a quality in the Fallout universe of being beyond the edges of what any major faction has yet reached. a region that the NCR's westward focus and the Brotherhood's East Coast operations have both left largely uncontested. The Great Lakes region, which Minnesota borders, represents a freshwater resource of extraordinary value in a post-war world where clean water is among the most contested of all commodities. Michigan sits at the center of the Great Lakes freshwater system, and its pre-war significance as a manufacturing center, the automotive industry and its associated supply chains, would give its ruins a particular character of industrial abundance and industrial toxicity combined. The Detroit metropolitan area would present post-war survivors with one of the most complex urban environments in the American interior, a city whose pre-war significance was both economic and cultural, and whose ruins would be rich with the artifacts of that significance. Maryland borders the capital wasteland directly, and its post-war condition is largely understood through the lens of its proximity to Washington and the various factions that have competed for influence in the region. The cities of Baltimore and Annapolis would represent significant post-war territories in their own right, and the Chesapeake Bay corridor would be one of the defining geographical features of any large-scale political competition for the capital wasteland region. Louisiana's Gulf Coast position and its pre-war petrochemical infrastructure make it a region of particular interest in any comprehensive account of Fallout's America. The bayou country of southern Louisiana would present post-war survivors with a landscape of extraordinary ecological resilience and extraordinary danger, wetlands that can sustain human life for people who know how to use them, and that can be deeply hostile to those who do not. Kentucky connects to Appalachia on one side and to the broader Ohio River system on the other, a geographic position that makes it a corridor through which post-war trade and conflict both naturally move. The bluegrass region's horse farms and bourbon distilleries would be among the more distinctive pre-war cultural productions that post-war survivors might find themselves inheriting or fighting over. Luxury items whose production requires both specific agricultural conditions and specific knowledge. Kansas sits at the geographic center of the country, a position that in pre-war terms made it a hub for agricultural production, and in post-war terms would likely make it one of the quieter territories. Too far from any existing major faction to be immediately contested, too flat and open to defend easily, but too productive in its vast farmland to be entirely ignored by anyone trying to build something lasting. Iowa carries in Fallout's framework the particular significance of being part of the agricultural heartland that fed the pre-war nation, and whose post-war condition would depend heavily on the extent to which radioactive contamination disrupted soil productivity in the region. The Mississippi River border and the Missouri River corridor give Iowa natural geographic anchors around which post-war settlement would likely organize. Indiana connects the Ohio corridor to the Great Lakes region, its pre-war industrial character giving it the same combination of ruined infrastructure and potential resource wealth that characterizes much of the industrial Midwest. Indianapolis, as a pre-war hub, would present post-war survivors with a large urban ruin at the center of a relatively navigable region, the kind of city that tends to become a regional anchor point for whatever organization proves capable of establishing itself there. Illinois sits at the crossing point of the Mississippi River and the Great Lakes system, with Chicago as its central monument to pre-war urban density and ambition. Chicago in the Fallout universe is suggested rather than documented, its presence implied by the franchise's general treatment of major pre-war cities as significant but costly territories. The Illinois Commonwealth would have been one of the administratively significant units in the pre-war emergency management structure, given Illinois' central position in the national transportation and communication network. Idaho carries in the Fallout imagination the quality of a state defined by its terrain, the Snake River Plain, and the mountains of the Sawtooth and the Bitterroot Ranges, creating a landscape of dramatic geographic variety that would present post-war survivors with both refuge and barrier. In roughly equal measure, The pre-war agricultural productivity of the Snake River Valley, particularly its potato farming, would translate in post-war terms to a region with genuine potential for sustaining a population, if the soil contamination permitted. Georgia sits at the center of the American South's post-war geography. Its pre-war significance as both an agricultural state and a military hub giving its ruins a particular density of both resource potential and contested territory. The Atlanta metropolitan area would represent one of the largest urban concentrations in the southeastern wasteland, a city whose pre-war role as a transportation and communication hub would make its post-war ruins both valuable and dangerous. Florida carries perhaps the most dramatically altered landscape of any state in the post-war fallout world. Its low elevation and its position jutting into the Gulf and the Atlantic, making it particularly vulnerable to both the direct effects of nuclear exchange and the secondary effects of rising water levels and altered weather patterns. The Florida Peninsula in a post-war setting would be a region in active geological transition, its edges uncertain and its interior a mix of swamp and scrubland, and the ruins of coastal resort communities whose pre-war purpose would seem almost incomprehensible to post-war survivors. The Everglades and the swamp country of southern Florida would present a landscape that post-war mutation has made even more complex than it was before. A dense and water-threaded wilderness where the boundary between land and water shifts with the season, and where the creatures that inhabit it have had 2 centuries to adapt to changed conditions. The Keys, if any of them remained above water, would represent isolated communities with a particular quality of self-sufficiency born of enforced separation from the mainland. Delaware is among the smallest states and the most thoroughly swallowed by the broader context of the capital wasteland region. Its pre-war identity as a corporate and legal hub giving way to whatever arrangement post-war factions have made of its proximity to both Washington and Philadelphia. The Delaware River corridor would be a navigational route of real significance for anyone moving between the coastal settlements of the former mid-Atlantic states. Connecticut sits in the heart of New England, its pre-war history of manufacturing and finance giving its ruins a specific character of institutional wealth turned to rubble. The submarine base at Groton would have been a significant military facility in pre-war terms, and would presumably be both a target of early destruction and a site of considerable post-war interest for any faction with naval ambitions. Colorado is one of the more evocative, undocumented states in Fallout's geography. Its combination of high mountains and arid eastern plains, creating a landscape of dramatic contrasts that would translate powerfully into a post-war setting. The Denver metropolitan area and its airport, the military installations of Colorado Springs, and the research facilities throughout the Front Range corridor would give a Colorado-set Fallout game an enormous range of pre-war infrastructure to work with. The Rocky Mountain Range that dominates western Colorado would provide both natural defensive positions and natural barriers to movement, creating the conditions for the kind of isolated community development that tends to produce interesting factions. High-altitude settlements in the Colorado Rockies would face specific challenges of thin air and severe cold and limited agricultural potential, but would also enjoy the kind of natural defensibility that more accessible territories lack. Arkansas carries in Fallout's general framework the character of a state whose pre-war significance was primarily agricultural and military. Its Ozark Plateau, offering terrain similar to the Appalachian foothills in its combination of natural beauty and community isolation. The Arkansas River and the Mississippi River border would give the region navigational connections to the broader river system, and the Hot Springs area would represent a geothermal resource of potential value in a post-war energy landscape. Arizona, as documented through Fallout New Vegas and its associated lore, is perhaps the state most thoroughly reshaped by Caesar's legion's expansion across the Southwest. The desert geography of Arizona provided the legion with terrain that rewarded its particular organizational style. its preference for mobile formations and rapid movement, and the kind of harsh conditions that tend to eliminate the weak and concentrate the strong. The Colorado River's role as a boundary between Arizona and Nevada gives it enormous political significance in the Mojave region, and the river crossings, of which Hoover Dam is the most significant, represent the physical infrastructure through which regional power is projected and contested. Arizona's vast desert stretches east and south from the river, and Caesar's legions claimed to that territory, enforced through crucifixions along Interstate 40 and the various punitive actions that gave the legion its fearsome reputation, represents one of the more thoroughly documented territorial arrangements in post-war American history. The legion's relationship to Arizona's indigenous traditions is complex and appropriately fraught. Caesar having built his ideology on a particular reading of Roman history and having imposed that reading on the tribal cultures he absorbed and remade. The Hydabarks tribe, from which the legion's fearsome general legate Lannius came, was an Arizona origin group, and Lannius's story represents the extreme end of what the legion's cultural transformation could produce. A fighter of near mythological capability, whose brutality served Caesar's purposes so completely that it became a kind of institutional asset. New Mexico sits to the east of Arizona in the Fallout record, connected to the broader Legion territory and to the various communities that exist in the spaces between major factions. The Chaco Canyon region and the high desert terrain of New Mexico would present a post-war landscape of significant archaeological richness and significant difficulty of habitation, a place where the ruins of pre-war civilization layer over the ruins of older civilizations in ways that post-war survivors might find philosophically interesting if they had the leisure for philosophy. Utah, documented most fully in the Fallout New Vegas expansion, Honest Hearts, is the state whose physical beauty the game has treated with the most loving care. Zion Canyon, the location around which Honest Hearts centers its narrative, is presented as a place of remarkable preservation, its natural character largely intact in a way that makes it feel almost like a sanctuary from the wasteland's general condition of devastation. The conflict in Zion among the new Canaanites, the dead horses, the sorrows, and the white legs plays out against a backdrop of canyon walls and river crossings and pine forests that make the DLC's violence feel almost incongruous with its setting, which is presumably part of what the game was attempting. Zion's natural beauty is not diminished by the human conflicts occurring within it, and this quality of the landscape persisting through human drama gives Honest Hearts a different emotional register from most Fallout content. Joshua Graham's history as Caesar's Malpais legate and his subsequent fall and survival and religious transformation is documented in Honest Hearts with a kind of narrative depth that makes him one of the franchise's most compelling characters. His connection to Utah runs through his religious community of New Canaanites and their settlements, and his willingness to defend Zion reflects the way that place and meaning become intertwined for people who have survived the kind of experiences Graham carries. The dead horses and the sorrows, the tribal communities of Zion with whom Graham works, represent different approaches to survival in a post-war landscape. The dead horses' warrior culture and the sorrow's more cautious nature, both shaped by the specific demands of living in canyon country without access to the larger supply networks that Mojave communities can rely upon. Oregon sits above California and Nevada in the Pacific coastal chain, its pre-war character as an agricultural and timber-producing state, giving its ruins a specific texture of green and gray. The Pacific temperate rainforest ecosystem overlaying the structural remains of logging towns and farming communities, and the modest urban centers of Portland and Salem and Eugene. The Oregon Trail's historical resonance, that American narrative of westward movement and hardship and arrival, would carry a particular irony in a post-war Oregon, a place people once moved toward in hope, now existing in the imagination primarily as a distant territory of uncertain safety. The Columbia River, which forms Oregon's northern border with Washington, represents one of the most significant water resources of the Pacific Northwest, and its hydroelectric infrastructure, built in the pre-war era through major federal projects, would be among the most contested resources in any large-scale post-war political competition for the region. The dams of the Columbia system, if any survived the exchange intact, would generate the kind of power that makes serious political organization possible. California is the state most extensively documented in all of Fallout's geography, the location where the franchise began and where the deepest roots of its lore are planted. The original Fallout and Fallout 2 both unfold across California's wasteland, from the ruins of Los Angeles in the south to the settlements of the Central Valley and the northern reaches, where the new California Republic eventually established its capital at Shady Sands. The NCR's story is California's post-war story, the account of how a community founded by the survivors of Vault 13 eventually grew into a functioning republic capable of projecting military force across the entire southwestern wasteland. Shady Sands, which began as a modest settlement near the Vault's location in the Bakersfield area, grew across generations into the Republic's administrative and cultural center, a city of real size and institutional complexity by the time of Fallout 2. President Tondi, whose mother Aradesh was among Shady Sands' founders, and whose father the Vault Dweller helped establish the community, served the NCR for decades and oversaw its period of greatest expansion and consolidation. Tondi's presidency is regarded in retrospect as something of a golden era for the Republic, a period when institutional growth and political stability went together rather than working against each other. The NCR's expansion into the Mojave documented in Fallout New Vegas represents the overextension phase of a republic that grew faster than its administrative capacity could comfortably manage. The supply lines stretching back to California across the Mojave were always precarious, and the political cost of maintaining them always higher than the republic's leadership fully acknowledged to the people paying for them. California's resources and California's population supported a military presence thousands of miles to the east, and the people of California carried that burden without always understanding what they were carrying it for. The Hub, one of California's earliest documented post-war cities, grew around a pre-war water merchant community into one of the most significant trading centers in the western wasteland. The Hub's caravans, which eventually became organized into proper trading companies, created the commercial infrastructure that allowed NCR settlements to trade with each other and with communities beyond the Republic's formal borders. Without the Hub's merchant traditions, the NCR's economic life would have been far more constrained than it ultimately became. Los Angeles in the post-war California canon is associated primarily with the master's base of operations beneath the cathedral, that underground complex where the master coordinated his unity movement with the goal of forcing human evolution through controlled exposure to the FEV virus. The cathedral above ground served as a front for this operation, a religious institution whose surface legitimacy concealed the biological program proceeding in the vaults below it. The master's defeat at the hands of the Vault Dweller, achieved through argument rather than combat, remains one of Fallout's most philosophically interesting moments. The revelation that the Master's supermutants were largely infertile, undermining the entire logic of the Unity Project and making the Master's suicide the natural consequence of recognizing that his life's work was built on a biological impossibility. The Boneyard, which is what Los Angeles became in the post-war world, holds the ruins of that old civilization in a way that makes the city's former size and ambition visible in the scale of its destruction. The various factions that competed for control of the Boneyard during the events of the original Fallout, the followers of the apocalypse with their library and their commitment to preserving knowledge, the Blades and the Rippers and the Adytum and the Gunrunners with their heavily fortified factory, all of these groups oriented themselves around the ruins as though the ruins themselves were a kind of resource, which in many ways they were. The Mojave Desert, which straddles California and Nevada, is a landscape whose pre-war military significance was enormous, and whose post-war condition reflects both that significance and the particular ecology of high desert that makes it simultaneously harsh and strangely beautiful. The Mojave's nuclear testing history before the Great War gave it a relationship to radiation that preceded the bombs, and the various military installations scattered throughout the desert were designed with a war already in mind, even if the specific war they imagined did not quite match the one that eventually arrived. The San Francisco area, documented in Fallout 2, presents a post-war California of notable cultural complexity, with the Shi, descendants of a Chinese submarine crew that arrived at the coast in the aftermath of the war, having built a community of considerable sophistication in the ruins of the city. The Shi bring to Fallout 2 an awareness of the conflict's other side, the suggestion that Chinese citizens also survived the exchange and also built something in its aftermath, though what they built and under what conditions differs considerably from what Americans produced. Oregon Trail-era narratives of westward movement echo through Fallout's California-centric story in ways that the games acknowledge periodically. The NCR's own westward expansion into the Mojave, following the general direction of American continental ambition that defined the pre-war nation's self-understanding. California was always the destination of that movement, the place where expansion met the Pacific and had to turn inward to find somewhere new to go. Alaska, documented most directly through the Operation Anchorage DLC for Fallout 3, sits at the northern extreme of America's continental story, the place where the pre-war United States was fighting a land war against Chinese forces in the final years before the bombs fell. The Anchorage Reclamation Campaign, which drove Chinese troops from Alaskan territory in January of 2077, was the last major American military victory of the pre-war era, occurring within months of the nuclear exchange that ended the world. General Constantine Chase, who commanded the Alaskan campaign, becomes accessible to the lone wanderer through a military simulation preserved by the outcasts in the capital wasteland. The simulation is acknowledged within the game itself to be an imperfect reproduction of the actual campaign, altered by Chase's own memories and preferences in ways that make it more heroic and less complicated than the historical record might support. This quality of the simulation, its status as a curated and self-serving version of a real event, gives Operation Anchorage a metafictional quality that the game handles with more care than it sometimes gets credit for. The T-51 power armor, which became the standard heavy infantry protection for American forces during the Anchorage campaign, first saw widespread combat deployment in Alaska. Its introduction represented a significant shift in the balance of the Alaskan conflict, and the image of power-armored soldiers moving through snowbound terrain became one of the defining visual records of the war's final phase. Alaska in winter, as the campaign's surviving records suggest, was a landscape that imposed itself on every military calculation with a force that neither side could entirely plan around. The Boston area of Massachusetts, which becomes the Commonwealth of Fallout 4, carries New England's post-war story as its primary narrative. Boston itself, with its concentration of universities and research institutions and hospitals, was a pre-war center of technological and intellectual activity. And the Institute, which operates from a facility deep beneath the former MIT campus, represents the continuation of that intellectual tradition in a form that its original architects would likely not entirely recognize. The Commonwealth's condition as a relatively contested political territory 2 centuries after the bombs reflects the particular challenges of rebuilding in a dense urban environment where resources are abundant, but factions numerous. The Railroad, the Brotherhood of Steel, the Institute, and the Minutemen each represent a different answer to the Commonwealth's central questions about what kind of future is worth building and whose interest that future should serve. Diamond City, built within the preserved bowl of Fenway Park, represents the Commonwealth's most successful attempt at large-scale civilian governance. Its population and its market making it the region's closest approximation to an actual city. The protective walls of the old stadium give Diamond City a quality of visible security that the surrounding wasteland lacks, and the political life of the city, its elections and its newspapers and its class tensions, reflects the messiness of democratic governance operating under conditions that strain every institutional mechanism. The railroad's underground network, modeled explicitly on the historical Underground Railroad of pre-Civil War America, represents the Commonwealth's most overtly idealistic faction, a group organized around the principle that synthetic humans deserve the same moral consideration as organic ones. The railroad's commitment to memory, wipes, and relocation, giving sense new identities in places where they will not be searched for, requires its members to accept a relationship to secrecy and self-erasure that shapes the organization's culture in specific and sometimes difficult ways. The Institute's position as both the Commonwealth's most technologically advanced organization and its most feared represents one of Fallout 4's central, irresolvable tensions. The Institute's research capacity is genuinely extraordinary. Its second generation and third generation synth technology, representing achievements that no other organization in the franchise has approached. And yet, the methods through which that research was conducted and the uses to which it has been put make the Institute's legacy deeply compromised. Father's decision to recruit the sole survivor as his successor is an attempt to resolve this tension through the introduction of outside moral perspective, an attempt whose success depends entirely on what the player chooses to do with the position. Good Neighbor, the settlement in the old Scollay Square neighborhood of Boston, operates according to a social contract different from Diamond City's. Its tolerance of all manner of behavior and its ghoul-friendly culture making it the Commonwealth's most genuinely diverse settlement. Hancock's leadership of Good Neighbor through its mayoral structure reflects a kind of charismatic libertarianism, the insistence that freedom means allowing people to make their own choices while maintaining enough order to prevent those choices from destroying the community entirely. The supermutant presence in the Commonwealth, particularly concentrated in the quarry and military installations of the region, connects to the broader history of FEV experimentation that runs through all of Fallout's documented lore. The Commonwealth's supermutants are notably more intelligent in some cases than those documented in other regions, a variation that suggests either different mutagenic conditions or different source populations for the transformation. Maine, as the northernmost of New England states, sits at the edge of the documented Commonwealth region. Its coast and its forests and its island communities representing a territory that even the most exploratory Commonwealth factions have only partially mapped. The fog of the coastal regions, combined with the post-war mutations of the marine ecosystem, would make Maine's coast one of the more specifically dangerous territories in the northeastern wasteland. New Hampshire, Vermont, and the other New England states surrounding the Commonwealth proper exist in Fallout 4 as implication and context rather than direct documentation. The suggestion of a larger regional landscape that the game's map represents only partially. The traditional New England qualities of self-reliance and community insularity would presumably manifest in interesting ways in a post-war setting. The region's history of small-town governance and community mutual aid, providing either the foundations for functional settlement or the fault lines of parochial conflict. Rhode Island, the smallest state in the Union, sits within the New England wasteland as a territory defined by its density, its small geographic area packed with the remnants of pre-war urban life and industrial activity, and coastline. Providence and Newport, its significant pre-war cities, would be ruins of particular architectural and historical richness, their preserved colonial-era buildings creating an interesting contrast with the industrial and residential structures of more recent vintage. The southern states, considered as a group, represent a region of Fallout's America that has received less direct documentation than either the West Coast or the Northeast, but whose general post-war condition can be inferred from the broader patterns of the franchise's world building. The Gulf Coast from Florida to Texas would present survivors with access to marine resources and with the specific challenges of subtropical climate and hurricane-level weather events in a world without organized disaster response. Alabama and Mississippi, and Louisiana and Arkansas, the Deep South states, would carry the particular weight of their pre-war agricultural and petrochemical economies in ways that translate to both resource availability and environmental contamination in the post-war period. The cotton and soybean and corn agriculture of the Mississippi Delta would have been disrupted by both radiation and by the collapse of the supply chain dependencies that industrial agriculture requires, and the return to more traditional farming methods, if it occurred, would have been a painful and generationally demanding process. The Carolinas, both north and south, connect to the Appalachian story through their mountain regions and to the coastal story through their Atlantic seaboard. Research Triangle Park in North Carolina was one of the pre-war world's significant centers of technological development, and its post-war ruins would presumably be objects of considerable interest to any faction with scientific aspirations and the capability to reach them. The mid-Atlantic states from Maryland through New Jersey carry the particular density of the pre-war nation's most populated corridor, the string of cities from Washington through Baltimore, through Philadelphia through New York, that formed the northeastern megalopolis. This corridor's post-war condition would represent both an extraordinary concentration of ruined infrastructure and an extraordinary density of dangerous territory. The combination of population and strategic significance having made it one of the most heavily targeted regions in the nuclear exchange. The Great Plains states, Kansas and Nebraska, and the Dakotas and Oklahoma and parts of Texas represent a middle ground in Fallout's geographic imagination between the heavily documented coasts and the mountainous west. The plains' agricultural potential and their relative distance from the most concentrated nuclear targeting would make them, in theory, among the more survivable post-war territories. Though the collapse of the water and power infrastructure that industrial agriculture requires would make that agricultural potential difficult to realize in the near term. Oklahoma sits at the intersection of the southern plains and the southwestern desert, its pre-war character shaped by the dual heritage of Native American territory and oil industry development. The Dust Bowl history of the region, that catastrophic agricultural collapse of the 1930s that drove millions of Oklahomans westward, would give a post-war Oklahoma a particular resonance, the sense of a region that had already survived one kind of environmental collapse and might bring that knowledge, however hard won, to surviving another. The Rocky Mountain West, Colorado and Idaho and Montana and Wyoming, forms a geographic unit in Fallout's imagination defined by high terrain and relative isolation, and the specific combination of military presence and natural resource extraction that characterized the pre-war West. The mountain communities of this region would face the challenges of altitude in cold and limited agricultural land, but would have access to water from snowmelt and to the natural defensibility that elevated terrain provides. Utah's canyon country, as Honest Hearts documented so lovingly, represents the extreme of the Rocky Mountain landscape, terrain so dramatic and so specifically demanding that only people who have learned to read it can move through it safely. The canyon systems of southern Utah create natural corridors and natural barriers that make navigation both possible and predictable, channeling movement in ways that favor those who know the land over those who are simply passing through. The Pacific Northwest, Washington and Oregon, and northern Idaho forms a coherent bioregion defined by its temperate rainforest climate and its river systems and its particular combination of urban and agricultural and wilderness landscapes. The Columbia River Basin would be a zone of significant post-war resource competition. Its hydroelectric infrastructure and its salmon runs and its agricultural valleys, all representing forms of wealth that surviving factions would recognize and seek to control. The question of what Alaska looks like in the current Fallout timeline, which is to say in the period around 2281, when Fallout New Vegas takes place, is one that no game has yet directly answered. The Anchorage campaign succeeded in its immediate military objective, but the nuclear exchange that followed only months later would have subjected Alaska to the same catastrophic conditions that transformed everywhere else. The northern latitude and the cold climate would have shaped the post-war trajectory of Alaskan communities in specific ways, and the isolation of the territory, its separation from the lower 48 by both distance and potentially by the destruction of whatever remained of transportation infrastructure, would have made Alaskan communities develop along paths quite different from those documented in the main Fallout games. The Hawaiian Islands, though not strictly part of the continental American story that Fallout tells, exist at the edge of the franchise's imagination as a territory whose post-war fate is entirely undocumented and therefore entirely open to speculation. Hawaii's military significance in the pre-war Fallout universe, its location and its bases would have made it a target, and its island geography would shape survivors' options in ways fundamentally different from the continental mainland. The territories and commonwealths that the pre-war United States administered beyond its 50 states, Puerto Rico and Guam, and the Virgin Islands and the various Pacific territories, also sit in the undocumented margins of Fallout's world, their post-war conditions a matter of inference from the general patterns of the franchise, rather than direct canon. Puerto Rico's location and population, and its complicated relationship to the pre-war United States, would presumably be reflected in equally complicated post-war arrangements. The District of Columbia, which is not technically a state, but which stands at the center of one of Fallout's most fully documented territories, carries the weight of being the literal capital of the nation that ended the world. The ruins of Washington's monuments and government buildings, preserved in Fallout 3 with remarkable fidelity to their pre-war forms, even as everything else around them has fallen to ruin, create a landscape of particular symbolic density. Walking through the Lincoln Memorial, or past the Washington Monument in the wasteland, is walking through a space that was designed to communicate the permanence and grandeur of American civilization, and finding those designs partially intact in a world where that civilization has ended is one of the franchise's most quietly devastating visual statements. The Capital Wasteland's factional politics, the Brotherhood of Steel's fortified Pentagon base, and the Enclave's return to American authority claims, and the various raider groups and the struggling wastelander communities trying to maintain ordinary life amid. All of these play out against that backdrop of national symbolism, which gives even the game's smaller conflicts a quality of meaning that they might not carry in a less historically loaded landscape. Rivet City, the carrier converted into a floating settlement under the Francis Scott Key Bridge, represents one of the Capital Wasteland's most successful attempts at building something durable from pre-war materials. The ship's isolation from the mainland, the difficulty of reaching it, gives it a quality of defensibility that land-based settlements lack. And its internal community, with its market and its science lab and its residential quarters, and its complicated social dynamics, is one of Fallout 3's most fully realized living environments. Megaton, built around an undetonated nuclear bomb embedded in the center of its settlement, carries a symbolic weight that the game handles with its characteristic blend of dark humor and genuine unease. The community that has grown around the bomb, that has made it a focal point of religious devotion and civic identity, represents the full range of human responses to living with the knowledge of potential destruction, the capacity to normalize anything given enough time and enough need. The Great War that ended the world in the Fallout universe unfolded on October 23, 2077, a date that is scattered through terminal entries and holotape recordings and loading screen text throughout the franchise as a kind of recurring liturgical reference. The war lasted approximately 2 hours in terms of active nuclear exchange, which means that the world as it existed before was destroyed in a period shorter, than most business meetings, shorter than most films, shorter than most drives between neighboring cities. What the bombs produced was not simply destruction, but transformation. The conversion of a world organized around specific assumptions about chemistry and biology and ecology into a world organized around entirely different ones. 2 centuries of that transformation have produced the wasteland, which is not simply the pre-war world damaged, but something genuinely new. An ecology and a culture and a political landscape shaped by 200 years of adaptation to conditions that no pre-war planning had anticipated or designed for. The vaults, those sealed communities that Vault Tech built and the government endorsed and the American public was encouraged to see as the nation's survival insurance, represent the pre-war world's most systematic attempt to control what came after. The experiments conducted within them, which only gradually became clear as the franchise's lore accumulated across multiple games, suggest that the vaults were never primarily intended as shelters, that the survival narrative was always cover for a research program aimed at determining how human populations respond to extreme conditions, social isolation, resource scarcity, artificial authority, and the various other stressors that the experiments imposed. This revelation, which the franchise has made available gradually rather than all at once, gives the vaults a quality of betrayal that resonates through every story that emerges from them. The people who entered the vaults believing that they were being saved were also simultaneously being enrolled in experiments they had not consented to. Their suffering and their social dynamics and their biological responses all recorded by Vault Tech's monitoring systems for purposes that the residents themselves were never told. The post-war world's condition of distrust toward institutions, its general wariness of organizations that claim to serve the common good, has roots that go back to the vaults as much as to anything else. Every state in America has its own relationship to this broader story, its own position in the web of military installations and corporate facilities and Vault Tech construction projects and pre-war political arrangements that shaped what the post-war world became. The geography of Fallout's America is not random. Its vaults and its ruins and its surviving communities, all located where they are for reasons that trace back to pre-war decisions, to where the government built its bases and where the corporations located their plants, and where the population concentrated, and where it chose to make its shelters. Traveling through those states in imagination, moving from Wyoming's open quiet to Appalachia's burning mines, to the Mojave's neon-lit ambition, to the Commonwealth's industrial ruins, to Alaska's frozen distance, is traveling through a record of those decisions and their consequences, a geography of choices made by people who believed they understood the future, and a landscape shaped by everything they got wrong. The America of Fallout is recognizable and alien at once, a mirror held at an angle that shows both what was and what came after, the shape of a nation still visible in the ruins of its infrastructure, and the persistence of its cultural habits even in people who have never known the world that produced those habits. The flags still fly in some places, the monuments still stand, the names of the old states still appear on signs and maps, and in the names that communities give themselves. All of it testifying to the durability of geographic identity, even when every political and social structure that once gave it meaning has been replaced or destroyed. The wasteland remembers the states even when the states no longer exist in any functional sense, the way that a person might remember the name and the character of a neighborhood that was demolished decades ago. The specific quality of a place inscribed in memory, independent of the physical fact of its continuing existence. Fallout states are like that, their names and characters persistent in the lore even when their territories have been divided among factions that recognize none of the old boundaries, even when the communities within them have developed identities that owe more to post-war experience than to any pre-war heritage. And that persistence, that quality of geographic memory surviving catastrophe, is perhaps the franchise's most quietly hopeful element. The suggestion that places matter to people in ways that outlast the institutions and the political arrangements through which places are officially defined. The wasteland wanderer who knows they are in Utah or Nevada or West Virginia knows something about where they are that goes beyond the factional affiliations of the settlements they pass through. Something about the texture of the land and the character of the region that the bombs could damage but could not entirely erase. This is the gift that Fallout's cartography offers to the people who pay attention to it, the sense that the world has a memory even after the people who made it have largely gone, that the land holds its own record of what happened here and what it cost, and what against considerable odds survived. Every state in Fallout's America tells that story in its own voice, through its own ruins and its own surviving communities and its own particular combination of what was lost and what, somehow, endures. The night moves slowly through the wasteland, and the stars above it are the same stars that shone over every state before the war, the same light reaching down through changed air to illuminate a changed world. Somewhere in Wyoming, the wind moves through open country that has known both settlement and abandonment, and has remembered neither as a loss. Somewhere in West Virginia, the mines are still burning, and the Mothman watches from a ridge with eyes that reflect a light whose source no one has ever traced. Somewhere in Nevada, the neon of New Vegas continues its patient vigil against the darkness, a small and brilliant argument for the persistence of human desire. Somewhere in Massachusetts, the Institute's lights burn in their underground chambers, and the railroad moves through tunnels that remember being something else entirely. Somewhere in California, the NCR continues the slow work of building something that might last. And somewhere along the Mojave's long roads, travelers move between settlements with their own maps and their own reasons and their own ideas about where they are going and what they will find when they arrive. The states endure in this way as settings for stories still unfolding, as landscapes still being navigated, as the geographical record of a nation that ended and the world that came after it. Their names carry the weight of everything that happened there, and everything that might yet happen. The promise that the map is not finished, that somewhere in the blank spaces between what the games have documented and what they have not yet reached, the wasteland continues its patient transformation into something that no one who designed the pre-war world could have imagined or intended. The Midwest region as a whole, encompassing states like Illinois and Indiana and Ohio and Missouri and Iowa and Minnesota and the various territories between them, occupies a peculiar position in the Fallout franchise's geographic imagination, one that is simultaneously central and underexplored. The pre-war industrial heartland of the American interior was defined by a network of rivers and rail lines and manufacturing facilities that connected the agricultural wealth of the plains to the population centers of the East, and the post-war condition of that heartland would depend heavily on which elements of that network survived the exchange and which factions were capable of recognizing their value and organizing around them. The Brotherhood of Steel has extended its presence into the Midwest, as documented by the Midwestern Brotherhood chapter, whose history forms the background of the Fallout Tactics storyline, a conflict that unfolded through Illinois and Wisconsin and into the upper Midwest with a ferocity that suggests the region was far from empty or unclaimed. The Midwestern Brotherhood, more politically flexible than its Western counterpart, and willing to recruit from outside the traditional military descendant population that the original Brotherhood drew upon, represents a different trajectory for that organization, one shaped by the specific demands of operating in territory where the Brotherhood's standard approaches had to be adapted to work. The Calculator, the rogue artificial intelligence whose underground bunker in Illinois served as the operational center for an army of malfunctioning robots and military automations, represents the kind of technological legacy that makes the Midwest particularly significant in Fallout's broader narrative. Pre-war America built its automated systems with enormous ambition and embedded them in facilities scattered throughout the country. And the post-war condition of those systems, which have been running without human oversight for 2 centuries, creates both opportunities and threats for the communities unlucky enough to exist near them. The Great Lakes themselves represent a freshwater resource of such enormous scale that they function almost as a geopolitical fact, their presence shaping everything around them the way a mountain range shapes the weather of a region. Any faction that established genuine control of Great Lakes access would have leverage over a significant portion of the post-war Midwest's viable settlement territory. And the political competition for that control would presumably be one of the defining conflicts of any Great Lakes-focused Fallout narrative. Lake Erie and Lake Michigan and Lake Superior, each of enormous extent and depth, would present post-war survivors with both the resources of fresh water and fish and the navigational challenge of crossing large bodies of water without the infrastructure that pre-war civilization had developed for that purpose. The small boats and improvised watercraft that post-war communities would develop for Great Lakes travel would create a specific kind of maritime culture in a region that most people think of as firmly landlocked. The Steel City of Gary, Indiana, whose pre-war industrial character made it one of the more environmentally troubled communities even before the bombs fell, would present post-war survivors with a landscape of toxicity and ruined infrastructure that might paradoxically contain significant metalworking resources. The blast furnaces and the ore docks and the rail yards of a mid-century steel town, damaged but potentially operational, would be the kind of industrial legacy that makes a community both dangerous to approach and impossible to ignore. Milwaukee and Minneapolis and St. Paul, the major urban centers of the upper Midwest, would carry their own specific post-war characters shaped by their pre-war industrial and agricultural and cultural roles. The Twin Cities, with their river confluence and their pre-war role as a regional hub for commerce and culture and transportation, would presumably be significant post-war territories regardless of which factions had organized around them by the game's timeline. Kansas City, positioned at the meeting point of the Kansas and Missouri rivers, and the traditional eastern terminus of the old frontier routes, carries a specific resonance in American historical geography that would translate in interesting ways to the post-war wasteland, the city's role as a gateway to the West. Its identity shaped by being the last significant urban center before the plains opened up would give a post-war Kansas City a quality of threshold and liminality, a place where the eastern wasteland and the western wasteland negotiate their boundary. Oklahoma City and the surrounding oil country of central Oklahoma would present post-war survivors with one of the more directly valuable industrial legacies in the southern plains, the petroleum infrastructure whose pre-war products fueled the machines of American civilization. Whether any post-war faction has the technical knowledge and the organizational capacity to extract and refine petroleum from existing wells is one of the more interesting questions that a southwestern-focused Fallout narrative would need to engage. The Texas oil fields, which stretch across the Permian Basin and the Gulf Coast and the East Texas forests, represent perhaps the single largest concentration of extractable energy resource in the entire post-war American territory. The infrastructure for extracting and processing that oil was built to operate at industrial scale, requiring specialized knowledge and complex machinery, and the organizational capacity to maintain both. And whoever controls those oil fields in the post-war world effectively controls the most significant power resource in the region. The Texas Triangle, formed by Dallas, Fort Worth, Houston, and San Antonio, represents 3 of the largest pre-war urban concentrations in the American South, each with its own specific character and its own specific post-war legacy. Dallas-Fort Worth's role as a financial and technological center would give its ruins a specific character of institutional wealth. Houston's petrochemical and NASA connections would make it a site of both toxicity and technological richness. San Antonio's military presence and its position near the Mexican border would shape its post-war trajectory in ways that connect it to the broader story of the southwestern wastelands relationship to the territories south of the old national boundary, the border between the United States and Mexico, which features prominently in the backstory of New Vegas through Caesar's legion's origins south of that border and through the various communities that developed in the borderlands, represents one of the more interesting geographic complications of the Fallout universe's political arrangements. The old boundary, already a site of intense political and cultural negotiation before the war, would become in the post-war world a line on the land whose significance depended entirely on who was drawing it and why. Caesar's legion's origins in the Arizona-New Mexico borderlands and in the communities that had developed in the decades since the war, communities that drew on Mexican and Native American and Anglo-American cultural traditions in various combinations, gives the legion a geographic rootedness that its Roman aesthetic sometimes obscures. The legion was not simply an artificial imposition of Roman organizational forms on an empty landscape, but rather a synthesis of pre-existing communities and traditions organized under Caesar's ideological framework, and the borderlands geography shaped that synthesis in specific ways. The Gulf of Mexico coastline, from Florida through Louisiana and Texas, represents one of the more distinctive geographic settings in Fallout's American landscape, a region where pre-war petrochemical industry and fishing culture and subtropical ecology all mixed in ways that produced both richness and environmental complexity. The post-war Gulf Coast would carry all of these pre-war characteristics in transformed and amplified form, its waters warmer and more chemically complex, its coastlines altered by storm action and radiation, and the biological transformations that 2 centuries of mutation have produced. New Orleans, if any significant portion of it survived the nuclear exchange and the subsequent decades of storm and flood, and the particular challenges of below sea level geography in a world without organized flood control, would be one of the most culturally distinctive post-war communities in the American South. The city's pre-war character, its music and its food, and its Mardi Gras traditions, and its voodoo religious syncretism, and its French and Spanish and African cultural heritage. All of these would feed into a post-war New Orleans identity that would differ dramatically from the wasteland communities of the West and Northeast. The Mississippi River Delta, which builds and dissolves itself through the constant movement of sediment from the continental interior, would present post-war communities with a landscape in continuous geological transformation, its bayous and distributaries and barrier islands shifting in ways that make navigation both possible and unreliable. The communities that live in the Delta would develop an intimate relationship with that instability, learning to read the water's movements and to build structures that can accommodate the ground's impermanence. Moving northward up the Mississippi from the Delta, through the great river's middle reaches where the continent's drainage converges into one enormous southward flow, is to travel through the geographic backbone of the post-war American interior. The settlements that develop along the Mississippi would have access to both the river's navigational potential and its fishing resources, advantages that would make river communities more sustainable than many inland settlements, provided they could manage the political complexity of controlling access to a waterway that everyone in the region needs. The Appalachian Mountain Chain, which extends from Alabama in the south through the spine of eastern states all the way to Maine in the north, represents a continuous geographic feature that shapes the post-war landscape of nearly a dozen states. The mountains create natural corridors and natural barriers, channeling movement and isolating communities and producing the specific kind of regional cultural distinctiveness that tends to develop in populations that have limited contact with their neighbors. The Appalachian communities documented in Fallout 76 are the most fully realized expression of this pattern in the franchise, but the same dynamics would apply to the full length of the range. The Shenandoah Valley, that long agricultural corridor between the Blue Ridge and the Alleghenies in Virginia, carries a particular resonance in American military history, its geography having channeled armies northward and southward in multiple conflicts. The post-war valley would present survivors with access to agricultural land that is more sheltered and more productive than the surrounding uplands, a geographic advantage that would make it contested territory in any serious competition for regional resources. The Piedmont region, that broad band of rolling terrain between the Appalachians and the Atlantic coastal plain, extends through the Carolinas and Virginia and Georgia in a zone of moderate climate and historically productive agriculture. The pre-war textile industry that once defined much of the Piedmont's economy has left its ruins in the form of mill buildings and mill communities, structures built for a specific industrial purposing whose post-war repurposing would depend on what materials and skills the surrounding communities could bring to them. The Blue Ridge Mountains themselves, gentle by comparison with the higher peaks of the Appalachians, but significant as a geographic boundary between the valley and the Piedmont, carried the specific ecological character of a temperate upland forest ecosystem. The post-war Blue Ridge would be a landscape in which the forests, freed from 2 centuries of organized logging, have grown in complex and vigorous ways. The tree canopy interrupted by the ruins of pre-war parkway infrastructure and the occasional vault entrance or military installation that chose the mountains for their relative inaccessibility. The Ozark Plateau, shared among Missouri and Arkansas and small portions of Kansas and Oklahoma, represents another upland ecosystem with its own specific character and its own post-war trajectory. The Ozarks' pre-war culture of self-sufficiency and community insularity, its traditions of small-scale farming and hunting, and the kind of intimate knowledge of local terrain that comes from generations of living in one place, would translate in post-war terms to communities that might be smaller and less politically organized than their lowland neighbors, but significantly more resilient in conditions of resource scarcity. The Black Hills of South Dakota, sacred in indigenous tradition and significant in pre-war American cultural mythology, would carry a specific weight in any post-war narrative set in that region. The Mount Rushmore Monument, whose 4 carved presidential faces represent a particular statement about American historical memory and national identity, would be one of the more dramatically visible pre-war cultural artifacts in the post-war landscape, its scale ensuring its survival even in conditions that have destroyed smaller monuments. The Badlands of South Dakota and North Dakota, those dramatically eroded landscapes of clay buttes and hoodoos and exposed geological strata, would present post-war survivors with terrain of extraordinary visual character and limited agricultural utility. The fossil richness of the Badlands, which made them significant to pre-war paleontology, would have no post-war scientific institution to recognize it, though the bones embedded in the eroding clay might provoke curiosity in survivors who found them without knowing what they were or how to think about them. The northern plains as a whole, that vast sweep of grassland from the Dakotas through Montana and Wyoming and into Nebraska and Kansas, would carry in the post-war world a quality of open possibility that is both genuinely liberating and genuinely threatening. The plains offer visibility in all directions, which means that both prey and predator can see across enormous distances, and the lack of natural shelter and the severity of weather in all seasons create conditions that demand specific adaptive strategies from any community trying to establish itself there. The Dust Bowl region, which encompasses much of western Kansas and Oklahoma, and eastern Colorado and the Texas Panhandle, carries the historical memory of a catastrophic agricultural failure that predates the nuclear war by more than a century. The soil erosion and the wind and the desperate poverty of the Dust Bowl era would resonate strangely in a post-war landscape where agricultural collapse is not a temporary regional disaster, but a comprehensive transformation of the entire food producing system. The Continental Divide, that long ridge of elevated terrain running through the Rocky Mountains from Canada to New Mexico, represents the geographical line along which the continent's water drains either eastward or westward. In pre war terms, it was a navigational and organizational boundary of real significance. In post war terms, it would continue to shape the movement of people and resources in ways that no political arrangement could entirely override. Communities on the eastern slope and communities on the western slope would develop in different directions, partly because the river systems that sustain them flow in different directions, carrying them toward different networks of settlement and trade. The Columbia River Basin, which the Cascade Mountains to the west and the Rockies to the east define as a distinct watershed, encompasses most of the inland Pacific Northwest and represents one of the more coherent geographic units in the post-war West. The Snake River, which drains Idaho and joins the Columbia in Washington, carries snowmelt from the Rockies through a landscape of remarkable agricultural potential in its lower reaches and remarkable wilderness in its upper canyon sections. The Snake River Plain, which stretches across southern Idaho in a long arc of volcanic basalt, represents one of the more distinctive geological features of the inland West. The volcanic history of the region, which includes the Yellowstone hotspot system extending eastward from the park into Idaho, gives the Snake River Plain terrain that looks unlike anything else in the American interior. Its dark basaltic surface, interrupted by lava tubes and cinder cones, and the occasional geothermal feature that continues the geological conversation between the Earth's interior and its surface. Yellowstone National Park, sitting at the boundary of Wyoming and Montana and Idaho, represents a pre-war landscape of extraordinary geological activity and ecological diversity that would translate in interesting ways to a post-war setting. The geysers and hot springs of Yellowstone, powered by the volcanic plume beneath them, would continue their geological activity regardless of what happened on the surface, their thermal features providing both a resource for nearby communities and a vivid reminder of the forces that operate beneath the apparent stability of solid ground. The Cascade Range, which runs north-south through Washington and Oregon parallel to the Pacific coast, creates a dramatic climatic boundary between the wet maritime conditions of the coast and the drier continental conditions of the interior. The mountain's volcanic nature, expressed in peaks like Mount Rainier and Mount Hood and Mount St. Helens, would continue in the post-war world the geological activity that made this range one of the more seismically active portions of North America. A post-war Mount St. Helens, whose pre-war eruption in 1980 was already a significant geological event, would continue its slow rebuilding in the post-war atmosphere, its periodic activity providing both a landscape feature and a navigational hazard for any community in its vicinity. The Olympic Peninsula in northwestern Washington, cut off from the mainland by Puget Sound and characterized by the most significant temperate rainforest on the North American continent, would present post-war communities with a landscape of extraordinary biological productivity and extraordinary rainfall. The Hoh rainforest and the Olympic Mountains together create a microclimate of unusual intensity, receiving more precipitation than almost anywhere else in the contiguous United States and supporting a forest ecosystem of remarkable density and age. The Coast Range, parallel to the Cascades and running closer to the Pacific, catches much of the moisture before it reaches the higher volcanic peaks, and the communities in the valleys between these two ranges would have access to agricultural land of genuine productivity. The Willamette Valley in Oregon, one of the most fertile agricultural regions in pre-war America, would be a significant post-war resource for any faction organized enough to work it, its mild climate and rich soil offering the kind of agricultural stability that the more arid regions of the West cannot provide. The Mojave Desert, which the games have documented in considerable detail through New Vegas and its associated content, extends beyond the immediate vicinity of the strip and the dam into a vast territory of extraordinary geological interest and biological adaptation. The desert's plants and animals, adapted over millions of years to conditions of heat and aridity, would continue those adaptations in the post war world while also accommodating the specific changes that radiation and FEV exposure have introduced into the regional ecosystem. Joshua trees, the iconic plants of the Mojave, would persist in the post war desert as they have in every desert through every climatic shift of the past million years. Their strange forms and their capacity to exist in conditions that defeat less specialized plants, making them one of the more visually distinctive features of the Nevada California desert. Their presence in the landscape of New Vegas gives the game's outdoor areas a quality of natural authenticity. The reminder that the desert was there before the pre-war civilization and will be there long after its ruins have been reclaimed by wind and sand. The Colorado River, which originates in the Rocky Mountains and flows through the canyon country of Utah and Arizona before crossing the California-Nevada border and reaching the Gulf of California, represents one of the most significant water resources in the American Southwest. Its use and overuse in the pre-war period, the enormous network of dams and diversions and water rights agreements that controlled its flow, would in the post-war world give way to a more direct relationship between communities and the river's actual volume and seasonal variation. Lake Mead, the reservoir created by Hoover Dam, would in the post-war world reflect whatever combination of drought and reduced upstream demand and dam operation determines its level. The lake's shores and its depths hold the remnants of the communities that were flooded when it was created in the pre-war era. Ghost towns beneath the water whose rooftops and main streets might become visible if the lake level dropped sufficiently. This layering of submerged pre-war history beneath the post-war surface is one of the more poignant geographic details of the Mojave region. The Grand Canyon, which the Colorado River carved across millions of years of geological time, would in the post-war world continue its existence as one of the most dramatic landscapes on the planet. Its depth and breadth and the extraordinary visibility of its geological strata, each layer representing millions of years of accumulated sediment, would make it a significant feature of any post-war navigation through the Arizona desert, a landmark so large that no faction's territorial claims could ignore it. The Sonoran Desert, which extends from southern Arizona into Mexico, would carry in the post-war world the same extraordinary biological diversity that made it notable in the pre-war era. Its saguaro cactus and its desert tortoise and its Gila woodpecker, all continuing their particular roles in an ecosystem that has adapted to conditions more severe than anything the nuclear exchange could introduce. As genuinely novel, the saguaro's slow growth, their centuries-long accumulation of the specific capacity to store water in the forms that the desert demands, would continue in the post-war world as a quiet testimony to biological persistence. The Chihuahuan Desert, which extends through parts of New Mexico and Texas and deep into Mexico, represents the largest desert in North America, and a landscape whose post-war character would combine the general features of arid lands with the specific influences of the borderland's political geography. The pre-war cities of El Paso and Ciudad Juarez, sitting across the Rio Grande from each other and sharing an economy and a population that the international boundary never fully divided, would in the post-war world presumably have developed an even more intertwined identity, the old national distinction having lost most of whatever force it carried. The Rio Grande, which forms the Texas-Mexico border for most of Texas's southern extent, would be a waterway of enormous political significance in any post-war narrative set in the region. Its crossings and its fishing and its agricultural irrigation potential would all be points of competition and negotiation between the communities on both sides and the river's seasonal variability. Its tendency to flood in wet years and to shrink dramatically in dry ones would make its management one of the central organizational challenges for any post war political entity trying to establish itself in the borderlands. The Edwards Plateau of central Texas, that elevated limestone plain above the Balcones Escarpment, carries a specific ecological character that distinguishes it from the coastal lowlands to the east and the desert country to the west. Its springs, which emerge from the Balcones Fault Zone, historically made it a source of fresh water in an otherwise water-scarce region, and communities organized around those springs before the war would likely continue to find them valuable in the post-war landscape. San Antonio's Riverwalk, that pre-war tourist attraction built around the channelized San Antonio River through the downtown area, would in the post-war world be a navigational feature in a large urban ruin. The river continuing its flow through the broken structures that once channeled it decoratively. The missions on the city's south side, some of the oldest Spanish colonial structures in what became the United States, would represent pre-war historic sites of unusual durability. Their thick stone walls and their minimal dependence on mechanical systems, giving them a survival advantage over the lighter construction of the 20th century city around them. Houston's connection to the American space program, to the Johnson Space Center that coordinated manned spaceflight from the mid-20th century through the end of the pre-war era, would give any post-war Houston narrative a particular resonance with the broader Fallout universe's complicated relationship to science and ambition and the consequences of pursuing both without sufficient wisdom. The remains of Mission Control, if they survived, would be a kind of monument to a different kind of ambition than the one that built the vaults, the dream of reaching outward rather than inward, of expansion into an empty cosmos rather than down into sealed chambers beneath the earth. The relationship between Fallout's documented geography and the real America that inspired it is one of approximate correspondence rather than exact replication. The game's taking real places and real histories and transforming them through the specific lens of the franchise's alternate history. Its nuclear-powered cars and its 200-year-long Cold War and its pre-war aesthetic that never quite moved past the retrofuturism of the 1950s. This transformation is what makes the geography of Fallout feel simultaneously familiar and strange, recognizable as America and yet clearly belonging to a different America than the one that actually exists. The states of this imagined America carry their real counterparts' basic geographic features, the same mountains and rivers and coastlines, while the human history layered over those features diverges at specific points of alternate history and then accumulates across decades of different choices into a world that is unmistakably related to ours, but distinctly its own. Walking through the Mojave in New Vegas is walking through a Nevada that is, and is not Nevada, a landscape whose geology is real and whose human story has taken a different path. That doubleness is part of what makes the franchise's geographic storytelling so effective for the particular kind of quiet contemplation that the sleep documentary format invites. The listener can hold both versions of the landscape in mind at once, the real state and the Fallout state, and find in the gap between them a space for reflection on what the real history and the alternate history share, what human patterns repeat, regardless of which specific catastrophe shapes them, and what choices seem to matter most in determining what comes after. Every state, in Fallout's America as in the real one, carries the weight of what happened there, the specific combination of geography and human activity and historical accident that gives each place its character. That weight does not disappear when the bombs fall. It transforms. It is filtered through 2 centuries of post-war adaptation. It appears in new forms in communities that may not know the name of what they are inheriting. But it persists, the way that places always persist in the memories and the habits of the people who inhabit them. The way that geography shapes culture in patterns that outlast any specific political arrangement or historical moment. The quiet that settles over the wasteland at night is not the quiet of emptiness, It is the quiet of a world that has a great deal to say and is saying it slowly in the rusted signs and the crumbling monuments and the surviving names of things that no longer exist in quite the form those names describe. Every state is still there in the darkness, waiting for someone to walk through it and notice what it is holding. Rest now and let the maps fade gently. The states are all still there in the imagination's geography, waiting for the next wanderer, the next story, the next careful traversal of a landscape that holds more than anyone has yet had the time to fully find. The Fallout universe is vast in its documented geography and vaster still in its undocumented margins, the spaces between the games where the franchise has not yet looked and where, when it does look, it will find the same combination of ruin and resilience and the persistent human capacity for building something in the aftermath of everything that has been destroyed. Every state has its story. Most of those stories are still being written, one slow post-war year at a time, in settlements whose names the games have not yet recorded, and among people whose choices will shape what the wasteland becomes next. The states are all still there in the imagination's geography, waiting for the next wanderer, the next story, the next careful traversal of a landscape that holds more than anyone has yet had the time to find. The night moves slowly through the wasteland, and the stars above it are the same stars that shone over every state before the war, unchanged by what happened beneath them. Indifferent in the way that celestial things are indifferent, their light traveling from distances so great that the bombs and everything they destroyed are less than the smallest detail from that remove. Those stars watched the pre-war world build itself into something extraordinary and terrible, and they watched the post-war world doing the same more slowly with fewer resources, but with the same fundamental human tendency to make meaning out of whatever materials the landscape provides. The states persist beneath those stars, and the people in them look up at the same light that every generation of Americans has looked up at, and they find in it whatever they need to find: comfort or direction, or simply the reminder that the darkness between the stars is much larger than the stars themselves, but that the stars are there nonetheless, small and persistent and brilliant against everything that surrounds them. That is enough sometimes, that persistent small brilliance against the dark. It is enough to keep moving through another night, enough to wake in the morning and continue whatever the morning asks, enough to carry the name of your state and your region and your home in your memory as you walk through a world that has tried, on several occasions, to make sure there was nothing left worth naming. The story of Fallout's America is also in many ways the story of its roads. The pre-war highway system, that vast network of asphalt and concrete that connected every state to every other state, represents one of the most significant infrastructure legacies that post-war communities have inherited. Interstate highways don't disappear simply because the civilization that built them has collapsed. They persist as physical facts in the landscape, their surfaces cracked and invaded by vegetation, their overpasses structurally compromised in places, but still standing in others. Their route markers faded, but often legible to travelers who know what to look for. The roads of Fallout's America carry their survivors the same way they always carried the nation's traffic, from one place to another, across the long miles of wasteland that separate each pocket of human organization from the next. Interstate 15, which runs through Nevada and into California and was the primary artery of movement between Las Vegas and Los Angeles in the pre-war period, would in the post-war world be a route of enormous strategic importance to any faction seeking to project influence between those two regions. The Mojave Outpost at the Nevada-California border, documented in Fallout New Vegas, sits exactly where such an outpost should sit, at the point where the road crosses the boundary between NCR-administered territory and the contested zones further east. The highway itself becomes a kind of political fact, its physical existence shaping the movement of goods and people and armies in ways that the political arrangements of the post-war world are forced to accommodate. Interstate 40, the old Route 66 corridor that crosses New Mexico and Arizona from Albuquerque to the California border, is a highway whose post war significance is defined in part by what Caesar's legion did along its shoulders. The crucifixions of the twisted hares and other tribal enemies of the legion along the roadway in Arizona represent a particular use of infrastructure as political communication, the transformation of a transportation corridor into a message about the consequences of opposition. The road continues to carry travelers, but it carries alongside them the knowledge of what happened there, the warning written in the most permanent language the Legion could find. The roads that connect Appalachia's settlements in Fallout 76 tell their own story of infrastructure persistence and decay. The pre-war highway system of West Virginia, providing the organizational skeleton for a post-war landscape that had to be navigated without the benefit of functional vehicles for most survivors. Walking the old roads is slower than driving them was, but the roads still point in the right directions, still connect the places that need to be connected, still bear on their surfaces the faded markings of a transportation system designed for a different kind of travel. The old Route 66 itself, which predated the interstate system and carried generations of Americans westward through the dust and heat of the Central States, would in the Fallout universe carry a resonance similar to its real-world significance. A road whose cultural meaning exceeded its practical function, and that became a symbol of westward movement and open possibility before the bombs made all of that irrelevant and then somehow preserved it as legend. The Mother Road, as it was called, running from Chicago to Los Angeles through Missouri and Oklahoma and Texas and New Mexico and Arizona, traces a path through the heart of Fallout's undocumented America that any comprehensive account of the nation's post-war geography would eventually need to address. The Erie Canal corridor in New York, though the canal itself would long since have fallen into disrepair without the infrastructure maintenance that kept it navigable in the pre-war era, represents a geographic connection between the Hudson River and the Great Lakes that shaped the development of the American interior in the 19th century, and would, in a post-war world, still represent a logical route for movement between the northeast coast and the inland lake region. The valley through which the canal runs is still there, still connects Buffalo to Albany through the relatively low terrain of upstate New York, and any post-war traveler familiar with the geography would recognize its value. The Appalachian Trail, that pre-war hiking route that ran the full length of the Appalachian Mountains from Georgia to Maine, would in the post-war world be both more and less than it was before. More because in a world without functional road vehicles, a maintained path through mountain terrain is not a recreational amenity, but a genuine transportation resource. A route that skilled travelers can use to move through the mountains more efficiently than cross-country scrambling allows. Less because the maintenance that kept the trail passable in the pre-war era would long since have ceased, vegetation reclaiming the path in some sections and erosion destroying it in others, leaving a trail that exists only in fragments, identifiable by the occasional blaze mark on a surviving tree. The Mississippi River as a transportation corridor, which was central to American commerce for the first century and a half of the nation's existence, and which retained significance even after the railroad and the highway system displaced river commerce from its central position, would in the post-war world resume something of its historical importance. The river itself is unchanged by the bombs in its basic geography, its course still running from Minnesota to the Gulf, still connecting the interior to the coast. The boats that travel it would be different, smaller and slower, and powered by different means, but the river's logic remains the same: water flowing downhill, carrying everything that floats. The Great River Road, which follows the Mississippi through multiple states on both the Minnesota and Wisconsin banks, and the Iowa and Illinois banks, and the Missouri and Kentucky banks, and the Tennessee and Mississippi banks before, Reaching the Delta would be a post war route of genuine significance for communities trying to maintain commercial relationships across the river's considerable width. River crossings are among the most valuable infrastructure elements in any landscape, and the bridges that survived the exchange, or that were built afterward with available materials, would be controlled with the intensity of any valuable choke point. The Ohio River, which forms the boundary between the Upper South and the Lower Midwest across several states, represents another significant post war waterway. Its current navigable by small craft, and its valley historically one of the most productive agricultural zones in the interior. The confluence of the Ohio and the Mississippi at Cairo, Illinois, at the very southern tip of that state, would be a place of particular strategic importance, a point where control of one waterway gives leverage over the other. Any faction holding Cairo in the post war world would have influence over river traffic that few other territorial positions could match. The Cumberland Gap, that notch in the Appalachian ridgeline where Virginia and Kentucky and Tennessee meet, was historically one of the most significant passages through the mountains. The route through which Daniel Boone and the Transylvania Company's trailblazers brought the first large-scale American migration into Kentucky and the interior. In the post-war world, mountain passes retain their value even more than they did in the pre-war era, when highways and aircraft had reduced their significance. Any community that controls the Cumberland Gap controls one of the most natural corridors through the southern Appalachians. The Natchez Trace, that ancient path from Nashville to Natchez that had been used by indigenous Americans for centuries before European contact, and that carried American frontier traffic southward in the early Republic, would be another post-war route of practical significance. The Trace's path through Tennessee and Mississippi follows a route shaped by geography in ways that make it logically compelling, regardless of what civilization is using it. Its course through the highlands, between the Tennessee River and the Mississippi River corridor, a natural line of movement the human communities have recognized as such across thousands of years. The Blue Ridge Parkway, that pre-war scenic highway that followed the crest of the Blue Ridge Mountains through Virginia and North Carolina for nearly 500 miles, would in the post-war world be a route of genuine strategic value. Its elevated position, offering visibility across the Piedmont to the east and the Shenandoah Valley to the west, while its construction through relatively rugged terrain meant that it was built to a standard of durability that many lowland roads lacked. The overlooks and pull-offs along the parkway, designed to give pre-war tourists access to the views, would be natural campsites and observation points for post-war travelers. The Lewis and Clark Trail, which traces the route of the Corps of Discovery from the Missouri River to the Pacific, across what is now Montana and Idaho and Oregon, represents a geographic corridor that the post-war world would rediscover as one of the more viable routes across the northern Rocky Mountains. The mountain passes that Lewis and Clark navigated, particularly the Lolo Pass through the Bitterroot Range, are still the most practical routes through that section of the mountains, and any post-war faction attempting to establish connections between the Eastern Plains and the Pacific Northwest would find itself following roughly the same path. The Columbia River Gorge, where the Columbia cuts through the Cascade Range in a dramatic passage that Lewis and Clark also used on their return from the Pacific, is a geographic feature of such significance that the post-war communities of the Pacific Northwest would organize around it with the same intensity that pre-war communities did. The river's passage through the mountains at this point is the only sea level route through the Cascades, which means that controlling the gorge means controlling the primary connection between the interior and the coast. The pre-war communities of the Dalles and Hood River and Cascade Locks, positioned along this critical corridor, would in the post-war world be sites of intense competition if any organized faction in the region had the resources to contest them. The Donner Pass through the Sierra Nevada, that mountain crossing in Northern California, whose pre-war name carried the historical weight of the failed wagon train party that became stranded there in the winter of 1846. would in the post-war world be among the most significant mountain crossings in the West. The Sierra Nevada presents an enormous barrier to east-west movement across California, and the passes through it are few and seasonally unreliable. Any faction seeking to maintain connections between the NCR's California heartland and territories to the east would need to control the passes, and Donner Pass's relatively low elevation and its highway infrastructure would make it the primary crossing. The wagon roads and cattle trails that carried pre-war settlement across the Great Plains, the Oregon Trail and the Santa Fe Trail and the Chisholm Trail and the various other routes that organized movement across that enormous landscape, would in the post-war world resume something of their historical function. Without aircraft and without reliable vehicle fuel, the geography of the plains once again matters in the way it mattered to 19th century travelers. The river crossings and the water sources, and the elevation changes determining the viable routes and making the knowledge of those routes a genuine form of power. The Santa Fe Trail, running from Independence, Missouri to Santa Fe, New Mexico, across Kansas and Colorado, carried the commerce of the southwestern borderlands for much of the 19th century and would, in the post-war world, be a logical route for any faction trying to maintain connections between the Missouri River, communities, and the southwestern desert territories. The trail's passage through the Raton Pass into New Mexico, or, alternatively, through the Cimarron Cutoff across the dry high plains of southern Kansas and the Oklahoma Panhandle, offers two different approaches to the same geographic problem: the need to cross the Arkansas River watershed and gain the high plateau country of northeastern New Mexico. The Chisholm Trail, which ran northward from Texas through Oklahoma and Kansas to the railroad shipping points of Abilene and Dodge City, was historically a cattle route, a path defined by the needs of moving large animals across unfenced grassland. In the post-war world, similar routes would develop for whatever animals proved most valuable in post-war trade and subsistence, Brahman perhaps taking the place of the longhorn cattle of the pre-war era. The geography that made the Chisholm Trail viable, its route through relatively well-watered grassland with reliable river crossings, would make whatever post-war version of it developed equally logical. Brahman, those two-headed mutated cattle that are among the most consistently documented animals across Fallout's various settings, represent one of the more important post-war economic facts in the franchise. Their presence in every Fallout game, from the original through Fallout 4, indicates an animal that has survived and adapted to post-war conditions with remarkable success, maintaining enough of its pre-war cattle characteristics to be useful for both draft work and meat while developing the specific mutations that the franchise's FEV-altered ecology produces. The routes along which Brahmin are moved, the trails connecting their grazing areas to the markets where their products are sold, would be among the most significant commercial routes in any post-war region. The Brahmin drives documented in Fallout and Fallout 2, the caravans moving hides and meat and dairy products through the California wasteland, represent a kind of post-war pastoral economy that has developed spontaneously from the survival strategies of the first post-war generations. The hub's role as a commercial center for this trade, its position as the point through which Brahmin products flow into a broader exchange network, connects the franchise's economic geography to the real history of Western American cattle towns, those places where the products of the open range were gathered, processed, and distributed to the wider market. The caravans themselves, those traveling commercial operations that appear in virtually every Fallout game as either player supporting infrastructure or direct narrative elements, represent the post-war equivalent of the commercial networks that the pre-war economy ran on, where trucks and rail cars and container ships once moved goods across the country. Brahmin caravans move them at a fraction of the speed and volume, but through routes determined by the same fundamental geographic logic: water sources, defensible campsites, reliable fords, the avoidance of territories controlled by hostile factions. These shape caravan routes the way that fuel costs and road quality shaped trucking routes in the pre war era. The Crimson Caravan Company, one of the most extensively documented trading organizations in the Fallout universe, operates across Nevada and California and extends its reach into Arizona and the Mojave region in ways that make it something close to a commercial institution. A business large enough to have policies and hierarchy and the kind of organizational memory that allows it to function reliably even as individual personnel change. The company's relationship with the NCR, its use of NCR citizenship and NCR military protection as competitive advantages over its smaller rivals, represents the kind of alignment between commercial and political power that has characterized organized trade throughout human history. The gun runners, that weapons manufacturing and trading operation first documented in the original Fallout at their fortified factory near Los Angeles, represent a different kind of commercial institution, one whose product is violence enabling rather than food enabling, but whose organizational logic is similar. The gunrunner's ability to maintain manufacturing operations, to produce weapons at sufficient scale to supply a regional market, requires exactly the kinds of organizational capacity and supply chain management that make post-war commercial entities difficult to establish and valuable once established. Their fortified factory, their trade in both manufactured weapons and ammunition, their presence in markets from California to Nevada, suggests a commercial operation of genuine sophistication. The trading post settlements that appear throughout Fallout's wasteland, those communities that have organized themselves around a commercial function rather than primarily around a defensive or ideological one, represent a particular kind of post-war social contract. The agreement that the value of reliable exchange justifies the effort of maintaining a neutral space where different factions can do business without turning every transaction into a political conflict. The bazaars and the markets and the trading floors of post-war America, however informal they might look compared to their pre-war equivalents, perform the same social function that markets have always performed: the translation of different kinds of value into a common medium of exchange. Caps, the bottle caps that serve as the primary currency in most of Fallout's documented regions, represent one of the franchise's more interesting economic inventions. A monetary system built around an artifact of the pre-war consumer economy that survived in enormous quantities precisely because it had no value that anyone would bother to extract from it. The water merchants of the hub, who established the cap standard in the early post-war period by guaranteeing to redeem caps for water at a fixed rate, created a monetary institution out of scarcity and a psychology of trust that is, in its basic structure, not unlike the monetary institutions of the pre-war world. The bottle cap economy's geography is itself a kind of state-by-state map of commercial influence. The regions where caps are accepted as valid currency, marking the extent of the trade networks that the hub merchants and their successors established, and the regions where other currencies or direct barter prevail, marking the margins of those networks. Some communities in some states would presumably use entirely local systems of exchange, their distance from the main trade networks making the cap standard irrelevant to their daily transactions. The currency map of the post-war United States would be as fragmented as everything else about it. The new California Republic's script, its paper currency, represents a more ambitious monetary project, the attempt to create a currency backed by political authority rather than by a direct commodity guarantee. The NCR's ability to maintain the value of its script depends on its ability to maintain the political and military authority that makes the promise behind the currency credible. And the tensions between that ambition and the Republic's actual capacity are part of what makes the New Vegas narrative so economically interesting. Currency is always a statement of confidence in the issuing authority, and the NCR's currency is a statement of confidence in an institution whose ability to fulfill its promises is genuinely uncertain. The economy of the Capital Wasteland, as documented in Fallout 3, operates on a more fragmented basis with caps serving as a general medium of exchange, but with the various settlements and factions maintaining their own internal economies that may or may not connect smoothly to the broader regional market. Rivet City's economy, anchored by its market and its position as the region's most significant source of manufactured goods, would be distinct from the economy of Megaton, which would be distinct from the economy of the Raider-adjacent settlements, which would be distinct from the economy of the Brotherhood of Steel's semi-self-sufficient operations. The followers of the apocalypse, whose presence in both California and the Mojave represents one of the franchise's most consistently articulated alternative visions of what post-war civilization might aspire to be, have an interesting economic position. Their commitment to providing medical care and education without the commercial transactions that other factions' services require, making them simultaneously valuable to regional economies and structurally dependent on donations and trade relationships rather than on the revenue-generating activities that make organizations self-sustaining. The Followers' Library at the Old Mormon Fort in New Vegas, their medical clinics and their schools represent a kind of post-war public goods provision that the market-oriented economies around them cannot easily replicate. The question of what post-war states do with their pre-war public infrastructure, the roads and the bridges and the water systems, and the electrical grids that serve the pre-war population, is one that the franchise engages with primarily through the specific cases of Hoover Dam and the various other large infrastructure elements that appear in the games. The general answer seems to be that post-war communities use what they can reach and can maintain and abandon the rest. Their technological capacity and their organizational resources both being too limited for comprehensive infrastructure management. The infrastructure that survives is the infrastructure that happens to be in a location where someone organized and capable has chosen to settle. Power grids are among the most significant infrastructure elements in the post-war landscape. Their capacity to concentrate and distribute energy being the prerequisite for almost every form of industrial production and most forms of sustained community life. The capital wasteland's relatively primitive energy situation, with most communities dependent on generators and scavenged power sources, contrasts with New Vegas's situation of actual grid electricity provided by Hoover Dam. And that contrast explains a great deal about why New Vegas is able to sustain a level of civilization that the capital wasteland cannot approach. Energy is not just a convenience in the post-war world, it is the foundation on which everything more complex rests. The pre-war electrical grid, which covered the continental United States in a network of transmission lines and substations and generating facilities, would in the post-war world be largely non-functional. Its components damaged by the exchange and by 2 centuries of neglect and weather, and the scavenging of its metal components by communities desperate for building materials. But portions of it would survive, particularly the portions associated with hardened military or governmental facilities, and those surviving portions would be among the most valuable infrastructure elements in their regions. Their potential restoration, a project worth fighting over. Solar energy, which pre-war California had developed at significant scale in the Mojave Desert, would in the post-war world retain its basic function since the sun continues to shine regardless of what has happened to human civilization. The pre-war solar infrastructure of the Mojave, if any significant portion of it survived the exchange, would be an enormous resource for any post-war community capable of operating it. The technology required to use solar electricity is significantly more accessible than the technology required to maintain a nuclear power plant or a large conventional generator, which means that a surviving solar installation might be among the more realistically operable pieces of pre-war energy infrastructure. Nuclear power, both through the fusion cores that power everything from portable generators to the power armor of the Brotherhood of Steel, and through the larger reactors that powered pre-war facilities, represents the franchise's characteristic energy technology, the specific vision of atomic power as the post-war era's primary power source. The fusion cores scattered throughout every Fallout game, are among the more interesting technological artifacts of the franchise's alternate history. Objects whose existence implies an entire industrial system for their production and distribution that no longer operates, but whose output persists in the objects themselves. Still storing their charge after 2 centuries, the pre war nuclear power plants that would have served the various states of Fallout's America represent in those states' post war landscapes objects of both enormous potential value and enormous potential danger. A functional nuclear reactor would generate the kind of power that could transform a regional economy, and many post war factions would presumably be interested in restoring any reactor that survived in operable condition. But nuclear reactors require specific technical knowledge to operate safely, and the post war world's general educational decline means that the number of people capable of managing a reactor safely may be very small. The research universities and technical institutes of the pre war United States, those institutions where the knowledge required to maintain complex technology was both generated and transmitted, represent in their post war ruins one of the more poignant losses of the nuclear exchange. MIT, which becomes the Institute's underground continuation in the Commonwealth, is the franchise's most direct engagement with this theme. The question of what happens to institutional knowledge when the institution that housed it is destroyed. The Institute's answer, which involves rebuilding the institution underground and continuing its research programs in isolation, preserves a form of technical capacity, but at the cost of the connection to the broader society that gives technical knowledge its meaning. The medical knowledge preserved by the followers of the apocalypse, and the various other healers and doctors and medics who appear throughout the franchise's documented regions, represents a different kind of knowledge preservation, one that is distributed and practical rather than centralized and theoretical. The followers' commitment to making medical knowledge available to wasteland communities reflects an understanding that knowledge hoarded is knowledge that eventually dies with its hoarders, while knowledge shared survives in the practices of the communities it reaches. Vault City in Fallout 2. That community of Vault survivors who emerged from their shelter with significantly more technical knowledge than the surrounding communities, and who used that knowledge as the basis for a social hierarchy that kept outsiders at arm's length, represents one vision of how technical knowledge translates to political power in the post-war world. Vault City's medical technology, its ability to perform procedures that no one else in the region could replicate, gave it leverage over every community within reach of its services. And the city used that leverage with the unsentimental practicality of an entity that understood very clearly what it was worth. The relationship between knowledge and power in the post-war world is one of the franchise's most consistently explored themes, visible in every game across every regional setting. The Brotherhood of Steel's hoarding of pre-war technology, the Institute's secretive research programs, the Enclave's insistence on its governmental authority as the legitimate heir to pre-war American institutional knowledge, all of these represent different versions of the same claim that the possession of superior technical knowledge entitles an organization to the power that follows from it. The counter-argument, articulated by the followers of the apocalypse and by various wasteland communities who have developed practical knowledge through experience rather than institutional inheritance, is that knowledge's value lies in its application to human needs rather than in its restriction to those who can pay its price. The printing press, or its post-war equivalent, is another technology whose presence or absence shapes the knowledge geography of the post-war states. Communities that have access to some form of text reproduction, even crude mimeograph-style duplication, can disseminate information in ways that purely oral communities cannot. And the difference between literate and pre-literate communities in the post-war world is likely as significant as it was in any pre-modern historical period. The newspapers of Diamond City and the terminals scattered through every Fallout game represent islands of text-based communication in what is otherwise a largely oral wasteland. The holotape technology that appears throughout the franchise Those magnetic recording devices that preserve audio from the pre war period and the post war communities also use for recording and communication represents one of the more interesting cases of technology persistence in the post war world. Holotapes are simple enough to operate that their use survived even as the manufacturing capacity to produce new ones declined. And the recordings they contain represent a form of preserved voice that crosses the temporal boundary between the pre war and post war worlds in ways that written records cannot entirely replicate. Hearing the voice of someone who died 2 centuries ago speaks to something different than reading their words. The terminal computers that appear in every Fallout game, their green on black text interfaces still functioning after 2 centuries of neglect, represent perhaps the franchise's most persistent technology artifact. The suggestion that pre war computing infrastructure was built with a durability that modern electronics cannot approach. The information stored on those terminals, the pre war records of corporate activities and government programs and personal communications, provides the most direct window the post war world has into the thoughts and decisions of the people who preceded the catastrophe. Reading through a terminal in any Fallout game is doing something like archaeology, recovering fragments of a world that no longer exists from the storage media it happened to leave behind. The radio broadcasts that connect Fallout's wasteland communities to something larger than themselves. The Galaxy News Radio of the Capital Wasteland and the Radio New Vegas of the Mojave and the Appalachian stations of Fallout 76 represent a form of community building that crosses the geographic boundaries that make in-person connection difficult. Radio reaches where roads do not, and the communities that hear the same broadcasts develop a sense of shared experience that can function as a substitute for the institutional connections that the pre-war world provided. Three Dogs broadcasts from Galaxy News Radio are simultaneously entertainment and news and ideological advocacy, combining functions that the pre-war world had separated into distinct institutional forms. The jukebox and the Pip-Boy radio that let Fallout players access these broadcasts and gameplay represent a specific vision of how music survives catastrophe. The pre-war music preserved in the game's carefully curated period soundtrack, those mid-century American popular songs that play in every Fallout title, serves multiple functions simultaneously. Diggetically, it represents music that survived on physical media and is being broadcast from surviving stations or played on surviving playback equipment. Thematically, it creates the dissonance between the song's cheerful pre-war optimism and the devastated landscape in which they play that is one of the franchise's most distinctive tonal achievements. Historically, it anchors the franchise's alternate timeline in a specific cultural moment, the era of its aesthetic departure from the real world's timeline. The culture of the pre-war United States that the franchise's aesthetic choices recreate, that mid-20th century American popular culture with its chrome automobiles and its advertisements for products that no longer exist, and its radio programs and its vault-inspired suburban optimism, is itself a kind of imagined state that overlays the geographic states of the franchise's America. This cultural state, this vision of a pre-war America, frozen at a moment of optimism about the future, is what the post-war landscape mourns even when no individual character is explicitly articulating the mourning. The gap between the cheerful Nuka-Cola advertisement and the skeleton slumped beneath it is the gap that the franchise lives in, the space between what the pre-war world imagined itself to be and what it actually became. Nuka-Cola itself, that ubiquitous pre-war beverage whose bottles and vending machines appear in every corner of every Fallout game's environment, is perhaps the franchise's most successful piece of world-building shorthand. A single brand whose omnipresence communicates the character of pre-war American consumer culture more efficiently than any extended description could. The regional Nuka-Cola variants documented in Fallout 4's Nuka World expansion, the different flavors developed for different markets and different seasons, suggest a brand whose pre-war marketing operated at a national scale with regional customization exactly the kind of consumer product culture that the pre-war United States would have developed. The Nuka World Amusement Park, that pre-war entertainment destination whose post-war condition as a raider-controlled territory contrasts so sharply with its original function as a family entertainment venue, represents the franchise's engagement with the specific cultural form of the American theme park. The theme park was a pre-war institution devoted to the production of a particular kind of managed experience, a controlled environment designed to generate specific emotional states in visitors. And the Fallout franchise's use of that institution as a setting for the post-war wasteland's more ungoverned emotional terrain creates the kind of ironic juxtaposition that the series handles with skill. The Nuka World Galactic Zone and its quantum experience, the Wild West-themed Dry Rock Gulch, the safari-themed Safari Adventure, each of these theme park lands within the larger park represents a pre-war fantasy of a different kind, a managed simulation of a world that never existed or that existed only in the cultural imagination. The post-war raiders who inhabit these spaces have, in their way, remade the simulations into something more honest about the wasteland, replacing the managed excitement of the theme park with the unmanaged danger of actual occupation. The Wild West section, populated by actual raiders, is more authentically Western in the historical sense than it was when populated by pre-war costumed performers. The Silver Shroud, that pre-war radio drama character whose costume and aesthetic the Fallout 4 player can adopt in a side quest, represents another fragment of pre-war popular culture preserved in the post-war world, a fictional hero whose stories survived on holotapes and whose mythology has taken on a life in the Commonwealth's oral culture. The Silver Shroud's specifically noir aesthetic, that hard-boiled detective fiction sensibility of rain-slicked streets and moral ambiguity, fits the post-war Commonwealth's actual condition better than most pre-war fictional genres would, the wasteland being a place where moral ambiguity is the default condition and rain falls on the ruins rather than the mean streets of a functioning city. The detective fiction tradition that the Silver Shroud draws on, those pre-war stories of investigators navigating corrupt institutions and morally compromised landscapes to find truth in a world that preferred comfortable lies, resonates with the position of every Fallout player character, the outsider moving through a complex social landscape, trying to understand what is actually happening and who is actually responsible for it. The moral ambiguity that noir detective fiction made its stock in trade is the moral ambiguity that the Fallout franchise makes its central thematic substance. The insistence that the post-war wasteland is not a simple landscape of good factions versus evil ones, but a complex terrain of organizations, each pursuing their own vision of the good, with methods that create harm, in specific and often predictable ways. The vaults, returning to them after this long geographic journey, represent the organized attempt to manage that complexity, to control the variables of the post-war environment by sealing a controlled population inside a controlled space and subjecting them to controlled experiments. The failure of that project, which the franchise's lore makes clear, was designed to fail in specific ways and to succeed in others, is the starting point for every Fallout narrative. The vault dwellers who emerged from their shelters into the wasteland carried with them both the knowledge their vaults provided and the ignorance that their isolation had produced, and the combination of the two shaped what they built in every state they settled. Vault 81 in the Commonwealth, whose experiment involved developing FEV cures for mole rat mutations, represents a case where the experiment's failure to achieve its scientific goal actually produced a community of unusual viability. The vault's residents having survived in relatively good condition because the lead researcher's refusal to infect her charges with the experimental subjects allowed them to live normally even as the surrounding experiment failed. The accidental preservation of a functional community through one person's ethical refusal is one of the more quietly hopeful stories in Fallout's vault lore. Vault 111 The cryogenic preservation facility from which Fallout 4's protagonist emerges represents a different use of Vault technology, less as an experiment designed to produce data, and more as a facility designed to test the specific scenario of an emerging world leader with pre-war institutional knowledge and authority. The experiment of freezing a population for 2 centuries and then releasing them into the post-war world is an experiment in anachronism, in the question of what pre-war values and knowledge and relationships mean in a context that has moved 2 centuries past the moment that produced them. The sole survivor's experience of that anachronism, of recognizing the ruins of places they knew as living communities, and of encountering institutions whose history they know from the inside of its beginning rather than from the outside of its culmination, gives Fallout 4 a specific emotional texture of displacement and loss that distinguishes it from the other mainline games. The capital wasteland was strange territory for a vault dweller in Fallout 3 because it was unfamiliar. The Commonwealth is strange territory for the sole survivor because it is too familiar and completely unrecognizable at the same time. This tension between familiarity and alienation is one of the underlying geographic experiences of Fallout's state-by-state exploration. The states of Fallout's America are recognizable, their mountains and rivers and coastlines corresponding to the real geography of the real country, and they are completely changed. Their human landscapes transformed by 2 centuries of post-war development into something that maintains the shape of the original while having replaced almost all of its substance. Traveling through them is traveling through memory, and its dissolution simultaneously, the recognition of what was here and the confrontation with what is here now, occupying the same moment. The process of rebuilding that every Fallout game depicts in some form, whether it is the NCR's Republic building, or Diamond City's managed community, or the Minutemen's effort to restore something like governance to the Commonwealth, or the various smaller settlement projects that appear. Throughout the wasteland is always a process of working with what is available rather than restoring what was lost. The pre-war world is gone in a way that no amount of reconstruction can reverse. And the communities that understand this most clearly, that have built their future on the materials the post-war world actually provides rather than on a nostalgia for the world that preceded it, are the ones that the franchise presents as having the best chance of building something that lasts. The Minutemen's project in the Commonwealth is in some ways the franchise's most directly optimistic post-war settlement narrative. Its vision of scattered communities supporting each other through a loose network of mutual aid rather than through the hierarchical authority of a centralized organization. The Minutemen's history of failure, their collapse in the years before the player character's emergence from the vault, is part of what makes their potential revival meaningful. The knowledge that what they are trying to rebuild has already failed once, and that its failure was not inevitable, but was the product of specific decisions and specific failures of trust that might, with better leadership and better luck, be avoided the second time. The political geography that emerges from these state-by-state stories, the map of post-war America as a landscape of competing visions of what civilization should be and who should govern it, and on what basis, is a geography of permanent negotiation. The lines on the map of the post-war United States are not the clean lines of pre-war state boundaries, not the product of treaties and constitutional conventions and legislative decisions, but the messier lines of territorial control, of where a faction's influence actually reaches and where another faction's begins, of which roads are safe and which are contested, and which are simply abandoned to whoever happens to be moving through them at any given moment. This messiness is perhaps the most honest geographic statement the franchise makes about the post-war world. The acknowledgement that boundaries drawn by force and maintained by vigilance are fundamentally different from boundaries drawn by agreement and maintained by shared investment in the institutions that make the agreement meaningful. The pre-war states had their own history of contested boundaries and forced negotiation, but they had also developed, over 2.5 centuries, a set of institutions strong enough to make their boundaries generally legible and generally respected. The post war world is still in the process of discovering what institutions, if any, might eventually perform that function again. Every campfire in the wasteland, every small fire that a traveler builds at the end of a long day of walking through the ruins of whatever state they happen to be crossing, is a statement about that process. The person sitting by that fire has survived another day in a landscape that makes survival difficult, has maintained their capacity to navigate the geographic and political complexity of the post war world, and will wake in the morning and continue. The states endure around them as landscape and as memory, and as the slow accumulation of choices that will eventually determine what this part of the world becomes next. The fire burns, the stars continue overhead, and the map of America waits in the darkness for whoever is ready to walk it. The seasons in the wasteland move differently than they did before the war, or at least the survivors of 2 centuries of post-war life perceive them differently. Having grown up in conditions where seasonal change carries survival implications that pre-war Americans, with their climate-controlled buildings and their reliable food distribution systems, never had to consider. Winter in the capital wasteland means not just cold, but scarcity, the difficulty of moving through frozen terrain, and the reduction of the scavenging opportunities that milder months permit. Spring in the Mojave means the brief intensification of the desert's biological activity before the heat of summer makes even the most heat-adapted organisms reduce their movement to the minimum required for survival. Summer in Appalachia means the fullest expression of the region's post-war ecology, its forests dense with vegetation, and its creature populations at their most active. Autumn in the Commonwealth means the beginning of the preparation for winter that every competent settlement engages in, the gathering and preservation of whatever food stores will sustain the community through the months when outdoor production is limited. These seasonal rhythms, which pre-war Americans experienced primarily as aesthetic variation in a landscape they could otherwise control, would be in the post-war world among the most significant organizing facts of community life. Communities that failed to adapt their activities to seasonal rhythms, that did not harvest and preserve and prepare during the seasons that permitted it, would not survive to experience the following year's cycle. The wasteland's relationship to time is fundamentally agricultural, even in regions that are not primarily agricultural, because the basic human dependence on seasonal food production reasserts itself when the supply chains and refrigeration and global food distribution that pre-war civilization had built are no longer available. The night sky visible from the wasteland, freed from the light pollution that pre-war cities generated, and looking down on a landscape whose artificial light sources are sparse and dim, would be among the most dramatically different sensory experiences of the post-war world from the pre-war one. The stars that pre-war urban Americans rarely saw clearly would be fully visible from almost anywhere in the post-war landscape. The Milky Way arching across a sky whose darkness recalls the night sky of centuries before electricity. Wasteland communities would presumably redevelop the practical astronomical knowledge that pre-modern societies needed for navigation and seasonal timing, the stars serving again as the calendar and the compass that they were before electric light made them seem merely decorative. Navigation itself, in a world without GPS and without the standardized road signage and map infrastructure of the pre-war period, would be one of the more practically significant forms of knowledge in the post-war wasteland. The ability to read the landscape, to use topography and vegetation and water drainage patterns to determine one's position and identify the most efficient route between points, would be a valued skill in every post-war community that had reason to travel. The scouts and rangers and caravan guides of the post-war world would carry this knowledge as their primary professional asset, their understanding of the terrain they knew making them indispensable to any organized movement through it. The NCR Rangers, documented in Fallout New Vegas as an elite reconnaissance and law enforcement force, represent the institutional version of this navigational expertise. Soldiers trained specifically for extended operations in difficult terrain without the support infrastructure that conventional military units require. The Rangers' ability to operate across the vast distances of the Mojave and the territories beyond it reflects the specific demands of projecting political authority across a landscape where the roads are unreliable, and the distances enormous, the same demands that shaped the Texas Rangers and the various frontier law enforcement organizations of the pre-war American West. The Brotherhood of Steel's power armor, which allows individual soldiers to operate effectively in environments that would be dangerous or impassable without it, represents a different answer to the geographic challenges of the post-war world. The technological solution to the problem of moving through a landscape that has become hostile to unprotected human bodies. Power armor doesn't make navigation easier in the sense of knowing where to go, but it makes the physical act of going there considerably more survivable. And the Brotherhood's ability to project force across difficult terrain with armored soldiers gives it a geographic reach that lighter equipped factions cannot match. The Enclave's vertibird aircraft, those pre-war military helicopters that give the Enclave unprecedented mobility across any terrain, represent the ultimate answer to the post-war world's geographic challenges. The ability to move vertically over all the obstacles that make ground travel slow and dangerous. The Enclave's vertibirds appear in Fallout 2 and 3, and in Fallout 4 with the Brotherhood having acquired the technology, and in each case they function as a marker of the extraordinary power advantage that air mobility provides in a world where everyone else is moving on foot or on Brahmanback. The states of the post-war world look very different from the air than they do from the ground, and the factions that have access to aerial observation have an intelligence advantage over ground-bound competitors that translates directly into military and political leverage. The landscape of Fallout's America, taken as a whole across all its documented and undocumented states, is a landscape of extraordinary geographic diversity, expressing itself through the specific lens of the franchise's post-war vision. From the Arctic silence of Alaska to the subtropical complexity of Florida, from the Mojave's austere beauty to Appalachia's lush ruin, from New England's dense urban legacy to the Great Plains' open solitude. The country's geographic character persists through catastrophe in the same way that the rivers persist and the mountains persist and the coastlines persist, changed in detail but recognizable in outline, still defining the basic terms of human possibility in the places where people have chosen to live. The states endure, and within them, humanity endures, finding in each particular landscape the specific combination of challenge and resource that produces the next chapter of the long story that the bombs interrupted but did not end. If these quiet details helped you relax, there's another video waiting on the left of your screen. You can let it play as you close your eyes. You might hear something soothing before you fall asleep again. The quiet that settles at the end of this long geographic wandering is a different kind of quiet than the silence of empty territory. It is the quiet of things that have said what they needed to say and are now resting in the knowledge that the record exists, that the map has been walked, that the states have each been acknowledged in whatever capacity the surviving evidence allows. Wyoming's open north and West Virginia's burning south, and Nevada's lit center, and Massachusetts's industrial memory, and Alaska's frozen distance, all together composing a portrait of an America that chose particular paths and arrived at particular ends, and is still in the scattered communities of its wasteland, deciding what comes next.